Good morning, everyone. Dr. Lane, I think we're ready to start when you are. You're muted.
How about now?
There you go.
Okay, great. Well, so welcome everyone to the second day of the 6th Annual Pandemic Policy Summit. It's brought to you by the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs in the Bush School of Government and Public Service here at Texas A&M University. So just for a couple of moments, my mission is to give you a brief synopsis of what transpired on day one, and then to introduce our panel moderator for panel 3. Some of you may notice that at one time, Dr. Jerry Parker was going to be giving this presentation, and obviously I'm not Jerry, but I will try to fill his big shoes, and I think he will be hopefully joining us later in the day, in the morning. So I'm going to start off by actually just restating the National Academy's definition of the bioeconomy, which is the economic activity that is driven by research and innovation in the life sciences and biotechnology, and that is enabled by technological advances in engineering and computing and information sciences. That's a quote. It goes on a little bit later to talk about the complexities, and they are that the bioeconomy includes healthcare, agriculture and food, industrial processes, environmental remediation, so on and so on, including a political dimension and a legal dimension, which we'll hear about momentarily. So I think having been looking into the bioeconomy now for a bit, preparing here, the complexity of the bioeconomy seems to be the point that that surprises everyone. Now that we have a basic definition, there's almost no aspect of society that the bioeconomy does not impact. So let me just talk a little bit about what went on yesterday. In panel 1, Rosemary Gibson spoke, primarily from her book, China RX. And I should point out here that as we give these various presentations, we're not trying to beat up on any group or country or whatever. We just take the factual information and present it the best that we can. Rosemary's book happened to come out in a timely fashion because of the pandemic, which has pointed out the maybe some of the vulnerabilities in our access to various medications. I think one of the most interesting things that she pointed out was that there are some medications, drugs, that we must buy, and what's most concerning is that we're no longer capable of producing those medications, and one of those is antibiotics. Obviously, if we didn't have the antibiotics, it would be it would be a national disaster. The other thing she pointed out was supply chain issues, and when she was trying to make a determination as to where our medications originate, not only was that difficult, but making a determination of when you looked at our suppliers, who was supplying them with raw materials, and that any one of these points in the supply chain could act as a point where other countries, other entities could hold us hostage based on the fact that how critical these medications are to the United States. Ed Yu from the FBI provided an important perspective, and he spoke about our data. And it's our scientific data, but also our genetic information that's being obtained through the private sector, through genetic testing, And those who have access to that information have a powerful tool that again could be used, I don't want to say as a hostage situation, but could potentially be used against us. The discussion ensued about the use of vaccines as political tools. We're not doing that. In fact, we have certainly produced a plethora of vaccines, more than will be required for just the United States. So we have thought ahead about other countries in the vaccine production process. The interesting point that came up, and again, not trying to beat up on anybody specifically, but when the labels on things start to read not just made in China, but designed in China, there'll no longer be a use for the important contribution that this country actually makes to products and innovation. Dr. Norris spoke about the importance of our students. And we want to make sure that the rest of the world continues to send their best and brightest to American institutions, American universities. And one thing we tend not to do, we certainly teach them world-class science, but we don't tend to talk to them a bit about why it is that we have such powerful institutions and such first-rate science in this country. And it stems from the freedoms that are basically supported by our form of government. And for those who come from countries who are perhaps more totalitarian in their approach, it would be nice to let the students know why it is that the assets that they're seeking are located in this country and perhaps not others. In panel number 2, where we talked about technology, its potentials or positives and challenges or negatives, I actually pointed out that frequently people just wanted to talk about the negatives. And I was excited that there was a fair amount of positive information provided. Gigi Granval spoke about the necessity for training a workforce for the bioeconomy. And that here too, we wanted the best and brightest, both within our country and from elsewhere, to come to America, institutions, both academic and business, because we want to push back the boundaries of knowledge, and there'll be an important workforce aspect that has been under-addressed. Jerry Epstein talked about the National Academy's report on the bioeconomy. He was particularly well suited for this, since he was on the authorship list for that report. He brought up many aspects that the National Academy addressed, and I can't remember if it was he or others, but they posted the report. The report is lengthy, well, a good read, and has an excellent executive summary. And I encourage others to look at it. If you don't read the whole thing, you can go through and pick out the sections that are most pertinent to your areas of interest. And finally, Doug Friedman, who interacts extensively with the private sector and referred to himself, and I thought it was kind of interesting, as the techno-optimist. So he wasn't going to, dwell on the challenges of technology, but the potential. And one of the examples he gives is the development of an RNA or coronavirus vaccine in under a year. For those of us who kind of live in that world, I would have basically said impossible. And then not only was the vaccine created, but by paying forward, if you will, for the production, the minute the vaccine is approved, it will be ready for distribution, which takes many months under normal circumstances. Okay, that's my synopsis. I'm going to go on here with an introduction, but I'll remind folks that as we go through the two panels today, please be thinking of questions. This is an opportunity to ask the world-renowned people in these various areas of specialization, and they're happy to speak with you. So, and I keep looking down at my watch because I want to make sure I don't cheat Andy out of any time here. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Andy Morris. He is Dean of our School of Innovation. Actually, before that, he was Dean of the Texas A&M University School of Law. So Andy did his undergraduate work at Princeton, got his Juris Doctorate and Master of Public Health from the University of Texas at Austin, and his PhD in economics from MIT. I see here he also received a master's in education in educational technology. So obvious, Andy has way too much time on his hands. So he is affiliated with the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. And I don't want to drone on here. So Lauren, are we close enough to turn over to Andy, or?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So Andy, you're on. I also know Andy to be a good man, so I'm going to listen up.
Well, thank you, Glenn. You know, that master's degree was so I could get an Aggie ring. So,
very good.
an important thing to have in College Station. And that was the only way to get one after a careful survey of the catalog. We have a distinguished panel. Their bios that were listed in the conference material, so I won't repeat those. The way we've set it up is each of the panelists will speak for 10 minutes or so and give an overview, and then we'll have some discussion. So please be thinking of questions. It's a really interesting group that spans jurisdictions, continents, and disciplines. So I think we should have a very interesting discussion. And we'll go alphabetically, which may be the first time that Jacob Chirkow has gotten to go first. So I want to give him that opportunity. So Jacob is a professor at the University of Illinois, so I'll turn it over to him to start us off.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Andy. So as we previously discussed, I think we're going to do things slightly differently than maybe we did for at least some of the panels yesterday, where I think all of us are going to speak relatively briefly, and then we're going to have a little roundtable chat and take questions from the audience. So with that in mind, I'm only going to talk for about, I don't know, 7 to 10 minutes or something like that. So yeah, so the thing that I wanted to talk about to kind of get us started off, especially with respect to the way that we've been thinking about incentives for innovation, are the way that the United States is otherwise established by Dole as one of the primary methods of technology transfer, right? This is the federal statute that allows, for the most part, university researchers that receive federal funding to apply for and receive patents on their technology and to use that in conjunction with their universities in an effort to license those out to be commercially developed. So I think it's important to kind of start off with some of what Bayh-Dole's assumptions are, right? And I think generally in the non-pandemic world, one of the things that had been complained about prior to the enactment of Bayh-Dole was that university research wasn't really directed at translational work, right? It essentially is the basic science or basic engineering side of things. In addition, one of the assumptions underlying Bayh-Dole was that technology transfer was difficult without having this patent asset. So to the extent that there were many more hoops that a researcher who received federal funding had to otherwise receive a patent, this made technology transfer difficult from moving research from the university sector to the commercial sector. When we're talking about human therapies specifically, right, clinical trials and the regulatory gauntlet with respect to FDA, right, they're necessary and they're expensive, and they are things that, generally speaking, universities do not do. We have, both prior to Bidol and afterwards, imposed that cost on commercial developers to shepherd their products through the FDA approval cycle. In addition, the reality is that much of the technologies developed at university, there's huge market uncertainty about them, right? It's not entirely sure whether they're going to be commercially successful, even if they work or not. And so by essentially having patents to transfer this to commercial developers, we've, for the most part, kind of tamped down on some of the uncertainty that we would otherwise have. And these are typically true, right? I mean, I think that for the most part, these assumptions underlying Bidol have are both correct and have otherwise served the statute well. But then this brings us to COVID-19, which I think has otherwise upended almost every single one of these assumptions. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of these here. First, with respect to doing technological development for COVID-19, university research has been translational. Like, we are actually getting products out of universities. And I think diagnostics are one of the main areas of success here. We've had major diagnostics developed and used entirely in-house at universities or research institutions. One of the things that I'm proud of, especially here at University of Illinois, is our SHIELD testing system, which I don't know if you've been reading the news about this, which accounts for between 1 to 3%, depending upon the day, of all COVID testing in the United States. It is, just to be clear, testing on campus here at the University of Illinois, depending upon the day, constitutes between 1 and 3% of all testing being done in the United States. And this is something developed entirely in-house here at the University of Illinois. Technology transfer with respect to a lot of COVID-19 innovations has been easy because universities have been giving this stuff away. This is reflected in some of the EUA summaries that have been filed with FDA recently. And it also seems to stem from some direct investment from agencies like NIH and BARDA, for example, right? We're not necessarily worried about commercial development because some of the translational technologies coming out of university, we're freely giving them away, right? In addition, right, clinical trials, they're really expensive. We foist this burden on commercial developers. They're, borderline optional depending upon what the therapies are, especially for diagnostics now that we've had that HHS statement come out. FDA has really adopted a liberal EUA policy in terms of letting diagnostics and therapeutics in. And as I mentioned before, right, HHS recently prohibited FDA from overseeing laboratory developed tests. So the clinical trials, as opposed to CLIA certification that otherwise would have come with that, have essentially gone out the window. In addition, to the extent that we're worried about market uncertainty, and this is one of the reasons we have Bidol, the market's certain, right? The size is enormous, right? The market for COVID-19 diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines is literally everybody on the face of the earth, right? One of the ways that we have otherwise made the market even more certain in the United States, especially with respect to vaccine development, are advanced market commitments, right? This is, for example, HHS's proposal of $20 per dose to Pfizer before the vaccine was even demonstrated to be safe and effective, right? With that being said, I think there's a couple of nuances about this story, and so I just want to briefly go through some of those, right? So the first nuance with respect to diagnostics, right? Almost all of them have been developed in academic settings, and they're all workable straight out of the box, right? They're developed entirely with grant funding. We don't really need industry in any kind of appreciable sense, except for the extent of like commodity lab equipment and reagents, things like Falcon tubes and centrifuges and stuff like that, right? In addition, to the extent that we leaned on industry for some of these things to be scalable in the past, don't really need industry to scale stuff up here, right? Again, universities in-house are running hundreds of thousands of tests every single day. So to the extent that this is true, right, the requirement of having patents for most COVID-19 diagnostics just seems like a total deadweight loss. If we're developing them here, if we're scaling them, if we're freely giving them away, what purpose do patents serve, right? For therapeutics, slightly more nuanced, right? Some have been developed in academic settings. Many are workable straight out of the box, like convalescent sera, but others are more like traditional drugs. And so the need for true clinical trials seems to be unclear or maybe borderline, right? Again, here, to the extent that we have EUAs and advanced market commitments, this would also suggest that patents are less necessary than they would otherwise be in the typical context, right? Briefly about vaccines, right? Vaccines seem to be the opposite case, right? All so far have been industry developed, and manufacturing and scalability, I feel like I don't need to tell this crowd, are absolutely critical. Industry expertise is important, and we wouldn't be able to do it without them. Clinical trials are absolutely required, even in an abbreviated form, right? We didn't just give the United States 100,000 people or put 100,000 people through a clinical trial ringer for nothing. And while the market is indeed enormous, right, these advanced market commitments really make it certain, right? Pfizer, Moderna, they know exactly how much money, or they can do a very good prediction of how much money they're going to end up making off of some of the vaccines that they are going to develop. If it is true that the advanced market commitments allow for super competitive profits, right, patents do little extra work, right? I mean, if the super competitive profits are otherwise above what patents in a competitive vaccine market would have otherwise gotten you, patents are pointless, right? They don't get you any extra dollars kind of beyond what you would already earn. So if that's true, right, another thing to think about is whether or not patents would otherwise serve as an effort to exclude others from the market. And I think just from a political standpoint, and happy to answer this in the Q&A, there's really no realistic expectation for franchising. So I want to conclude on a broader point about, like, what does this all say about Bidole in general, right? So view one, not much, right? You know, COVID-19 is a special case. And to the extent that things are different in this circumstance, right, it's like really uninformative about drug development in the ordinary course of things, right? We're just going to go back to doing the way we've done things in the past when COVID-19 is over. So who cares that it was different now? That's view number one. View number two, maybe quite a lot, right? So if Bidole is really about technology translation, then COVID-19 innovations are essentially proof of the efficacy of non-patent incentives. And perhaps it is time that policymakers start thinking about those things, especially advanced market commitments, a little bit more seriously. All right, that's it from me.
Thank you, Jacob. That's really provocative, and I hope we'll get to explore that. And the question, one of my other hats is as head of one of our 4 technology commercialization offices here. So Texas A&M never does anything the simple way. So we have 4 things. And your mention of the Illinois program, if people are interested, I encourage to ask you questions about that. That is a remarkable success. And it's all the more remarkable that nobody seems to have licensed that from you for other universities to do it. So we all seem to have gone off on our own and done things less well. By all accounts, Illinois is the gold standard in both testing and making use of the test results to effectively keep the university and the community open. All right, next alphabetically is Dr. Singh, who will give us a perspective from India. Dr. Singh. You're still muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, for giving me this opportunity. I will be just, picking up where Jacob has just left. I mean, we are talking about bioeconomy, how to secure bioeconomy in this very phase. So just, emphasizing how to, get the flexibilities to secure the accessibility to medicine is not enough. We have to look the other side also. So in this very period, I mean, COVID-19 period, I mean, whether we have to consider it a very, very, unique situation, which everybody is agreed to that, that whether it is a business as usual or a very unusual situation where business must also be kept on, that we have to think about. So as far as this very situation is concerned, there is a requirement of strengthening the ties between the countries, and we have to unify our efforts to do that. And I mean, in doing that, diverse approaches are being there, all pervasive around the world. And sometimes it has been said that one kind of approach should be taken care of. which to me is not a right approach. There are different conditions to look into with different approaches, but their alignment must be to, provide the access or, facilitate that very access. Coming to this very patent scenario, I mean, how India is going through it and what are the various mechanisms available to it. So many of the provisions which many countries are trying to legislate or have been legislating in this very phase, India was luckily have those provisions in law, particularly Section 3D of Patent Act, which talks about anti-evergreening, which is being controversial also in terms of patenting. That is one of the potential provision which has been there. Along with that, there are numerous provisions which you can see in the form of compulsory licensing to provide the access in these emergent situations. And there are few very stringent provisions which also enable to government to acquire the patents also. Even if the invention is pending, they can use it. The government can use it. Along with that, there is one provision under Section 66, which talks about that if any invention is found or any patent is being found that it is not well in tune with the government interest or public interest, then that patent could be revoked. So on paper, it is not, that much viable as to the patent practice, because someone can say that they are very vehemently, restricting the patent practice. But if you see the practice in the real situation, you will find that how many times these are being invoked. So if you see like that, you will find that compulsory licensing, there are few cases where it has been invoked. And even then, even this very situation, Section 100, which talks about acquisition of patents, patent offices were all, very much prepared to do that. But as you know, every country realized that what is, viable for its own economy. So keeping in that thing in mind, India has not, those kind of provisions which are very, very stringent in that very legislation. The thing is that, India has been tuning up its bioeconomy before this very pandemic, and there is one council, that is Biotechnology Industry Research Assistance Council, which was just forging these ties with industries and international collaborations. And it was targeting that India must be on a big front with $100 billion US dollar economy, bioeconomy. But this very phase has posed different challenges before India. And as I said, that whether patents should be totally taken off or it should be there, that is a question which we have to look into. So in that very sense, the logistics which are aligned to the vaccine development, they may be taken care of by countries like India, that various startups and MSMEs, they are gearing up and they are catching up those opportunities where they can provide ventilators and many other, supporting mechanisms to this very phase. And there they are switching into to trigger something which would be also facilitating the access and supporting this very vaccine development, as well as these very small entities may also be incentivized in a manner where they can be empowered through this very mechanism. So that is being there. So coming to India's call, which is very peculiar, India and South Africa's call for the suspension, or you can say for the that very provision that intellectual property rights may be in form of patents or trade secret, or you can say copyright, they may be suspended for a particular period of time. And usually it is being expected that they are calling that at least it would be for 2 years. That was not being backed by many countries, including many developed countries, as well as Brazil also. So countries are looking at various solutions in their own way. So if you see that when WHO has aligned with that very patent pooling mechanism, then India was also out of it. So why it has not been a party to that? That is a question that may be a strategic choice which is being exercised by India. So there is a diversity in approaches, as I told you, and even the developing countries are also, in some way, a little bit, you can say, differential in their approaches. So in this very call which India and South Africa has made, why it has been resisted by the countries. So they say that there are various provisions already there, like compulsory licensing and many other provisions which could be invoked to tackle this situation. So there is no as such any need to, have that kind of suspension of enforcement of intellectual property rights as regards to vaccines, or you can say therapeutics or diagnostics. So vaccines, therapeutic and diagnostics, they are being also considered by WHO, or it has been emphasized by WHO that they must be considered as a public good. So here I must emphasize that, if you see the India's approach before this very TRIPS agreement, we were excluding food, drugs, and chemicals from patenting. So though these all these three sectors, food, drug, and chemicals, they have been developed in a way where patent has become a kind of, you can say, instrument which has triggered its development. So we cannot deny this very, role of patents. But how the patents have been used, particularly in life science industries and medicines, that is a worry, because it has been used as a strategic tool to defy the very purpose of the patents, which is to promote the scientific and technological progress and public good. Because the companies have not been able to build trust among its consumers. So that is a big ploy which I must highlight, that this is a great opportunity for these companies also to build trust and develop that kind of trust relationship with the public at large. And this is a situation where the exploitation could not be denied in long term. In short term, it looks very, very good. Very encouraging situation where patent pledges are being made and open development of these medicines are being done. But whether in long term, what could be the behavior of these companies, it could not be anticipated at this very moment. The other thing which I want to point out is that in the area of diagnostics, which Jacob has also highlighted, that given the recent patent trend, or you can say judicial decisions, which has been there in US also, they have been not that much encouraging for the diagnostics methods particularly. And if you see Indian law, it is explicitly excluded from the purview of the patents, like the diagnostic, surgical, or prophylactic methods. They are being excluded from the purview of patenting. So one thing is on, that is diagnostic tools may be developed, but the diagnostic methods may not be patented in that way. So what is the clear position of the patent trend in India? That is also not being properly explored. And there are various potential barriers in that regard. And first barrier which I see regarding the vaccine development is the data and transparency in that very process, that how many patents have been given to those components which are responsible for the vaccine production, that is not being readily available. And apart from that, how the patents have been filed, how the rejections have been made, that is not pretty clear. So that is one thing which India needs to improve. And with this, I just conclude India's position that it is being claimed as a pharmacy of world because of cost effectiveness of that very vaccine production or any other production system. But why patent is being totally, it should not be totally ruled out, because it is not the patent system which is bad. It is the practices and various licensing strategies which were not in tune with the patents. So having said that, I must conclude that India is on track of developing vaccines, but it is still in, very much in a very, you can say first generation vaccine developments. It's not advancing that much. So now it is channelizing its, mechanisms to do the needful. So I hope that that would be a good, perspective for India. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. It's always good to remember that the U.S. perspective is not the only perspective on these things, and the interests of developing countries and others are often quite different from the U.S. view, although the U.S. has been extremely successful in sort of strong-arming the rest of the world into adopting our view of patents and how they should be handled. Next on our list is Professor Peter Yu, from Texas A&M Law School. So always a provocative and interesting speaker. So Peter.
Thank you, Andy. So let me start by thanking the Bush School and the Scowcroft Institute. So we have two speakers talking about China. So both Phil and I have agreed that I will start talking about the policy issues, and then he'll get into some of the issues that are more technical and that will affect some of the US companies doing business in China. And so what I want to do here in the opening remarks is to pick up on some of the discussion we had on the first panel. So we were talking about economic statecraft. And so what I'm going to do here is to talk about what are the policy changes within China in the intellectual property area, especially with a focus on life sciences and biotechnology. And so we have been talking a lot about the piracy and counterfeiting issues in China, but there's an emerging debate that's actually changing, and that shows that there's a very different landscape, both in the pharmaceutical area as well as in the patent area. And so I think there are two different pieces of legislation that recently came up. I think is the most illustrative of what's going on there. The first one is the recent amendment to the patent law in China, which has been passed earlier this last month, and which will take effect in June next year. And so one of the provisions within the patent law is that the patent term will be extended similar to what we have here in the US with respect to the Hatch-Waxman Act. And so the term will be extended for up to 5 years, and the effective marketing period will be for no more than 14 years. And so you basically have the identical provision within the Chinese patent system in June. And so the idea is that China is trying to push forward with the development of the pharmaceutical sector. And the policymakers believe that a similar process would actually be very helpful to a lot of the patent applicants as well as a lot of the innovators within the industry. But a bigger piece of legislation, which is actually more eye-opening for me, is about the draft provisional measures on test data protection. And so in that provision, the law requires the protection of test data, so usually the clinical trial data in pharmaceutical sector, for 6 years with respect to innovative drugs. And this is actually not that surprising, considering China has agreed to have 6 years of test data protection based on the accession agreement when China joined the WTO. But the most surprising thing for me is that China is now pushing for 12 years of test data protection for biologics. And that's basically the standard we have in the United States. And that's also the standard that's higher than virtually all the free trade agreements that we have seen that US has been pushing for. And clearly, China is not at the same level of developing biologics as the US, but at the same time, there's a strong aspiration to go in the same direction. And that's why China has been heavily pushing for more test data protection and more similarities between the US patent system and China's patent system. And beyond what we have in the legal system, we can also find a lot of different statistics. And I would recommend the report from last year's Global Innovation Index, because that report focuses mainly on the cutting edge technology in the health sector. And so if you look at that report, it talks about how China has been the leaders in the health AI patents. And so China is behind the US, but is ahead of the EU and Japan. And so I think that is quite impressive, considering that China did not have a patent system in the early 80s. China has also been within the top 3 in terms of health patent publications. And so that is quite important as well. And finally, for those people who have been paying attention to what used to be called the Made in 2025 strategy, biomedicine and medical devices, especially high performance medical devices, have been listed as one of the top 10 priority sectors. And so you can see that China is definitely moving in that direction. And so what is the takeaway from this story about all the changes and the different landscape with respect to pharmaceutical and the patent system? There are 3 different takeaways, and I hope the takeaways will be helpful to those of you guys who are just interested in China or who are looking for a set up policy with respect to what's going on there. The first one is that the law is changing very quickly, and there is not a huge gap between what we have in the patent law in China and what we have in the US, as well as in other places like Japan or Europe. And I think that's quite important because we keep on pushing for more laws and more changes. And usually we go for criminal enforcement, we go for administrative arrangements, and we go for more statutory damages. But at the same time, when you look at what's going on there, the laws in China is actually closer to what we have in other parts of the world as we can imagine. And I think that is a very good example to show why when we look at the phase one trade agreement, a lot of the provisions that be included about what China has to change is actually pretty disappointing, I think, for a lot of the IP rights holders, as well as for a lot of American companies, in part because there are actually not a lot of laws to be changed in those areas that are considered as traditional IP, or that's been included in a TRIPS agreement, or that's been included in the international system. And so I think that's quite important. The second takeaway is that we need to reframe the debate about what's going on in China. And I think we typically talk about piracy and counterfeiting, but at the same time, we ignore the part that China has also been moving very quickly in the innovation area, right? So there's a tendency for us to assume that, well, if we don't have the right political system, we don't encourage freedom, and then it's very hard to innovate. But at the same time, there are different forms of innovation. Maybe breakthrough innovation, which was mentioned earlier from yesterday's panel, is difficult to achieve if you don't have a lot of freedom. People are not willing to take risk. But at the same time, China has been very successful in process innovation, in cost innovation, in different forms of innovation. And if you pick up from I think the second panel, I think the first panel when Ed was talking about how data is important, right? In the future, if we are focusing on artificial intelligence, maybe that type of breakthrough innovation will not necessarily be driving a lot of the developments. Is actually who is collecting the data with a more comprehensive database and who have the best data will actually be driving a lot of the economic sector. If that is the case, maybe some of the assumptions have to be thought through more deeply about whether that actually will hold on in the future. And so I think it's very important for us to reframe the debate. And if you look at the statistics, in terms of patent applications, based on the statistics we got from USPTO, China is behind Japan, South Korea, and Germany. But at the same time, China is right up there within the top 5 in terms of patent application. And this is not the statistics taken from the Chinese Patent Office, but this is actually taken from the PTO report. If you look at the statistics coming from Europe, China has about 16% of the applications in 2017, and is behind both US and Japan. So China is definitely up there with respect to the EPO patent applications, right? So there's a lot, an interesting innovation story that's been going on within there. And I think it's important for us to not overlook what's going on there, especially when thinking about policy. And the last takeaway is that we should not always have a binary debate. For me, there are basically 3 different buckets of issues. And when we think about policy, that will be quite important. The first one is about conflict. The second is about competition. And the third one is about cooperation. So tying to the theme of this summit, I think it will be useful to think about COVID-19. Right, with respect to COVID-19, I think I'll put in the conflict bucket those attempts to hack into our system to get the data with respect to the vaccines, with respect to other things, and or any type of theft of confidential information, right? So that will be in the conflict bucket. With respect to the competition bucket, I think vaccine development is a very good example, right? So obviously, some of the buckets are related to each other, but at the same time, I think there's a competition story with respect to what's going on, with respect to a lot of the development. And then cooperation, I think the best example is how how China has published the genome of the gene sequence with respect to the COVID-19 that's been found in the patient. And then I think the Pasteur Institute also quickly sequenced the genome with respect to European patients. And so that the scientists, doctors, and medical professionals can actually look at the strands and look at the different sequences to actually start taking action, right? So we actually need to have all three buckets. And I think that brings back some of the things that Andrew mentioned in some of his comments in the Q&A section, saying that, well, we should not just move so quickly to protectionism because there are actually a lot of different issues, and it's very important for us to identify the different issues. And so what I want to end on is actually tied to what's going on with respect to COVID and show how COVID may actually have changed some of the international landscape, and that would affect China. And so I want to focus on three different areas. The first one is with respect to nationalist policies. Right? So here in the US, there's been a lot of discussion about how we have a very nationalist policies with respect to PPE, with respect to medicines, with respect to vaccines. I think there's a raging debate with respect to vaccine nationalism. But there's a study done in Switzerland showing that 69 countries also have similar policies. Right? It's not just the US, it's also Japan, India, and a lot of other countries. So we are actually heading into the direction of countries trying to use nationalist policies to address COVID-19 and related issues. And that raises question as to what will be the implications if a lot of countries continue during COVID and after COVID, and how would that affect a lot of the US companies? So some of the issues that might come from China will be safety inspection, import and export, regulatory practices. If we have a very nationalistic on a lot of those issues, and that would be highly challenging for a lot of US companies trying to do business in China. And so that's the first area. The second area is that there's a resurgence of recent regionalism. A lot of countries now are looking to their neighbors to actually do cooperate, right? So you've heard about, for example, the COVID bubble between Singapore and Hong Kong, or between Australia and New Zealand, because that's just the most practical way to address some of the issues when they're trying to open up. And so you can see that a lot of regional developments are now going on, and ASEAN, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, actually has now become the biggest trading partner of China, in part because of both the sanctions from the US trade war as well as from the COVID-19. Just in mid-November, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, has been signed between those 10 different Southeast Asian countries and 5 other countries: China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So India was originally part of the negotiations, and India has been very active in actually advancing one of the 4 drafts on the IP chapter for that agreement. But India withdrew from the negotiations last year, and so India has not been part of the final agreement. But I think that's a very good example of how a lot of countries are now moving in a regional direction. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because a lot of countries are looking for regional arrangements to actually increase their bargaining power and to provide more supply of vaccines, diagnostic kits, and other things. And so I think that would be quite interesting in terms of thinking about whether a lot of countries are now starting to thinking more about local production or regional production. If they're going that direction, what would be the impact on the global supply chain for medical equipment, for vaccines, for therapeutics, for a lot of the health-related technologies? And the last thing I want to end on is actually about the fault lines in developing world. And so there's a tendency to assume that, well, when you get all the developing countries put together, they'll push for lower IP standards. But at the same time, because of the news narrative about the changing landscape in China, China is not always taking the same position as China used to take 10 years or 20 years ago. And I think Kshitij can also talk about how India has also been changing their position in light of how what type of changes we have in pharmaceutical sector as well. And one thing that is quite interesting with respect to COVID is that there has been a WTO waiver proposal. It's basically about how to waive some of the provisions within the TRIPS agreement in light of COVID. And that will include industrial designs, patent, copyright, and undisclosed information that's related to clinical trial data. And that proposal has been advanced by South Africa and India, but not Brazil. Brazil is not included there, and not China, right? So to the extent you're thinking about the BRICS countries teaming up together for a developing world, that is not happening. right? So I think that would be quite interesting. Another example is about COVAX initiative. China did not join the COVAX initiative until much later, even though other countries are already very active, right? So China clearly is thinking about whether that type of initiative is actually beneficial to its own national interest. And so I think that is also a very good example to show that there are some features within the developing world, and that would affect some of the policies over there. So let me pass it back to Andy.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our final panelist is Dr. Zhang. I'll turn it over to him, and then we'll go to some Q&A. You're still muted. There we go.
Okay. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope to make two quick points. One with regard to the U.S. and one with regard to China. So first, I hope to talk about is what does the pandemic tell me, a U.S. patent attorney of 20 years, about the biomedical innovation and patent protection in the U.S. And I'll also touch on China's IPR policy and what possible changes I can see that may be coming due to the pandemic. So with regard to the U.S., so based on what I've seen so far, I think the COVID-19 pandemic serves to highlight two things. One is the importance of biomedical innovation, and two is the importance of robust patent protection as a policy tool to support and foster such innovation. So we've all been captivated by the daily headlines of the unfolding stories of vaccine development for COVID-19. And I think it's a manifestation of how critical biotechnology has become in fighting the pandemic. So in the race to develop safe and effective vaccines, two the most advanced programs, as we know, are based on the mRNA technology, a technology that is so new, it has yet to lead to an improved treatment. Well, until today, as we know, the UK just authorized under emergency use Pfizer's COVID vaccine. And due to its very nature, the mRNA technology allowed fast-paced development of clinical candidates and also fast and large-scale production compared to traditional vaccine technologies. So interesting to know is that technology developed, well, behind the two advanced vaccines are developed by two small startup companies. At least they used to be small, Moderna and BioNTech. In each case, the company was funded by university professors with funding from venture capital. So the first point I want to make is that IP policies and IP law should continue to encourage academic research and entrepreneurship, especially basic and translational research in critical areas of life science and healthcare, for example, in vaccine, antiviral, molecular diagnostics areas. And I think the mRNA, the emergence of mRNA technology is a very good example of how important biomedical innovation and policies that encourage such innovation is. So that's the first point I want to make. I've heard guests talk about molecular diagnostics. I actually have a somewhat different view on that. Purely from a technical technology perspective, when it comes to fast and accurate diagnostic and testing for COVID-19, I think the U.S. has not done well until even until today. There appears to be a lack of groundbreaking technologies in the field. And 9 months into the pandemic, an accurate and fast diagnostic tool remains elusive. So I recognize that it may be premature to suggest that the erosion of patent protection in molecular diagnostics field has had a direct link to the current state of the technology in the area. But I do hope to point this out. Most patent attorneys in this country know that in the past decade, there have been a number of court decisions and patent office guidelines that served to weaken patent protection for diagnostic tools. Many previously granted patents in the field were adjudicated to be invalid, and patenting diagnostic tools have become increasingly difficult in the US. So I suspect that the continued weakening of patent protection for diagnostic tools could have played a role in the lack of both a fast and accurate tool for diagnosing COVID-19. So, so the second point here is that I think it's going to be difficult to have policy that serves to weaken patent protection for certain policy reasons, of course, but while at the same time hope that it would encourage groundbreaking innovation. Now I'm going to turn to talk about China. Peter has said a lot about China, and which I all agree. So I'm just going to add, 2 points. First is that I think, broadly speaking, the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to increased reluctance or even hostility towards biomedical patents in developed countries. With regard to China, and again, I think this could be the case with other emerging markets as well, it's possible that the courts and the patent office start to place more scrutiny on antiviral and vaccine patents, especially that are foreign in origin, and become more protective of domestic players and homegrown innovations. Having said that, I'm also of the opinion that the overall trajectory of China becoming friendlier towards patents in general and patent protection of innovation drugs appears to remain in place. I want to remind people that when we talk about China and patents, I think we must be mindful of the big picture. The first US Patent Act was adopted in 1790. And the first patent, first US patent was issued that same year. The first Chinese patent law was adopted in 1984, with the first ever patent issued in 1985. And so which is less than 40 years ago. And real progress really started to happen in China around the time China joined the WTO in 2001. And in the past 20 years, China's patent framework, as Peter has said, has increasingly looked like a hybrid of European and US patent frameworks. That is again tweaked to suit China's domestic needs. And I think in terms of patent filing and patent grant, China is very similar to what you see in the US in Europe. In terms of patent enforcement, however, I think that's where weaknesses remain. And there's a significant different dynamic there in China than what you see in the US and in Europe. And this could in part due to historic reasons. Patent enforcement is still, to this day, a largely foreign concept. And also in terms of China's national policy, I suspect that availability of low-cost generics for the large population probably will remain a central theme of China's IP policy towards drugs for a long time. But despite that, there appears to be an overarching trend, which is that China is playing an increasingly important role in the worldwide ecosystem of biomedical innovation, which is consistent with China striving to become an innovator of new drugs, in addition to being the place where generic drugs are made. For example, China CROs have become key players in new drug development, and they turn more and more into collaborators and partners. And China has also become a major place for proof of concept studies and early stage clinical trials, as you know, which are key steps in proving safety and efficacy. And here is a very, very recent phenomenon. I would say in the past 2-3 years, Chinese biotech startups began to rival their counterparts in the US and Europe, both in terms of technical capabilities and access to investors and funding. And as a result, while in-licensing, meaning technology going into China, remains the predominant phenomena, but out-licensing is quickly rising and rising fast. So there is the possibility that a TikTok equivalent of in the forms of new drugs could be coming out of China in the coming years. So therefore, there is this fast changing landscape in China that should begin to favor increased patent protection and enforcement of drug patents. So in conclusion, I think the overall trajectory of China become more friendly to biotech innovation, and patent protection appears to be intact and remain in place. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of our panelists for such interesting and provocative comments. I will throw out a first question, and I encourage the audience to either raise your hand using Zoom's features or message Lauren with questions, and she's sort of compiling them and passing them on to me to do it. And we've got a couple in the queue from that as well. But I was particularly intrigued by a thread that seemed to run through the conversation here, unintentionally probably, but connecting some of Jacob's comments at the beginning about Baidole's impact or lack of impact on this. And from my point of view as somebody who's involved in university tech transfer, I say in general, universities aren't very good at tech transfer. So Baidole produced a massive spread of tech transfer offices, but did not produce the incredible unleashing of innovation and particularly patent royalties to universities that was anticipated. Maybe a dozen or two university tech transfer offices break even or better. And the great success stories in university tech transfer have largely been accidental. So Florida with Gatorade, Wisconsin with Warfarin, Stanford has been, and Berkeley have been very successful, and as have Harvard and MIT. But one of the things that distinguishes those offices is their presence in capitals of venture capital, which Dr. Zhang highlighted the important role of that. And for most of the rest of US universities or universities globally, we don't sit in areas with lots of venture capitalists trying to sneak in and invest in technology coming from our faculty. And most universities don't have a culture of entrepreneurship that really connects builds the desire among faculty to patent. Indeed, many universities suffer from a syndrome where patenting is seen as secondary to the university mission of generating new knowledge and disseminating it. Texas A&M, for example, is seen as a leader in this, much to my surprise, because we have formal rules permitting departments to consider patents in the promotion and tenure process. And just having that rule led to the University of California system inviting us to advise them on this. And I was like, well, I think you guys are actually ahead. And they said, no, you have a rule that makes a difference. So, and then the comments that, the rapid progress, the truly startling progress, and Glenn alluded to this at the beginning, in developing a coronavirus vaccine in a year, when there had never been a successful coronavirus vaccine except for one for cats. And I believe one for chickens that is not seen as particularly successful because it kills 10% of the chickens that get the vaccine. This was a remarkable breakthrough, and yet patents probably played relatively little role in that, right? This was truly universities doing what universities do, which was harnessing a massive amount of smart people and putting them to work on a problem. We certainly saw that at Texas A&M and our incredible pivot of researchers onto this. So is it the case that for future pandemics, and certainly there will be future pandemics and future emergencies of similar things, that patents are going to be sort of irrelevant to this, and we're gonna see things like the guaranteed payment system produce the innovation that's necessary? And if so, is it time to think about whether we've been doing the right thing with patents all along? So I'll let any of our panelists jump in. What should we, for the next pandemic, how do we get ready?
I would be reluctant to assume that the next pandemic is going to run the same course that this pandemic has done. Think about where you were in February. I mean, everyone who's on this Zoom right now, think about where you were in February. And many of you on this Zoom have been to the previous 5 pandemic policy summits. Could you have predicted the way that things ran now? Would you be able to predict that investment from 2017 from BARDA would have produced a first-in-class vaccine at that point 9 months later? I certainly couldn't. What guarantee is there that that's going to happen again? I would say that there's zero guarantee. It very well may happen. I think this was my point. This is my final point before I concluded, is that we should at least start thinking about non-patent incentives, about ways to manage this. But man, that is no guarantee it's going to come out to be similarly. So let me paint a different picture as a hypothetical to show what I mean, right? Let's imagine, really unfortunately, that the vaccine problem we have for this next pandemic is not a, can we get enough freezers? Can we make an mRNA vaccine fast enough, right? It's not an engineering problem. Like the distribution problem we have right now is an engineering problem. Imagine the next pandemic we have is the vaccine issue is a biology problem. We work at vaccines for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The pandemic is still going on, right? At that point, I think government's appetite to do things like non-patent incentives, like advanced market commitments, wane. They become politically unfeasible. And at that point, private industry just kicks in the way that they always kick in, right? And at that point, it may very well be the case that we do indeed need to fall back on the previous way that we've done things by, encouraging there to be a bunch of ex post private incentives like patents to drive industry forward. I think a lot of the treatment for HIV and AIDS has essentially followed this pattern, right? The vaccine issues there were non-engineering problems. The vaccine issues there and the treatment methods there are biology problems that take an incredibly long time to solve, right? So what's up with the next pandemic? I hate to put it this way, but it depends entirely on the biology of the pathogen.
Thank you. Any of our other?
Yeah, I mean, what you asked that whether we could sustain on a non-patent incentive model. So I think that we should explore. I mean, it is not that easy to do that because, as you see in the case of reward system, also we are not catching up that much because it gives arbitrariness on the part of government. So what would be the viable mechanism in doing that we have to think of? I think that in patent system itself, that flexibility is always open. I mean, you can, if you are, properly exercising that or, trying to find out within the mechanism, you will find many things. But few things are very, you can say, difficult. One is the pace at which you think that treatment must come or that product must come. Sometimes patent delays that very process, and that systematic delay is a kind of concern with the patent system, where many people see that is a problematic issue. Number 2 is that the monopoly which we grant, I mean, it is becoming also a very issue of concern because many developments are so rapid that I mean, many people can question that whether that very monopoly for 20 years would be, I mean, sustainable or would be given or not in the first place. So I think that we have to think over it, and but I'm not very certain about that very model. But yes, the exploration may be done.
So, if I may, so I just want to comment on whether patents serve a good incentive, in light of possibility of future pandemics. I think a step back, if I have to think about what factors are behind the U.S. being the leader in biopharmaceutical, I would have to say patents probably is among there in terms of the reasons, and maybe the most important incentive, because patents support a robust ecosystem, supports a healthy and strong private industry. So therefore, I think able to, during a pandemic, put together a lot of smart people and try to solve a problem. But that innovative spirit and ecosystem and strong healthcare industry cannot be there when it's needed, absent a robust protection through patents.
Thank you. Peter, do you want to comment on this?
Sure. So I'll add a few things. So let me pick up on what Jake said about how the next pandemic will be very different. I think a very good reference point for me is to look at what's going on in a lot of Asian countries who have been through SARS, right? So if you think about Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, you can see that they are much more prepared, right? So I think we are now facing a perfect storm where it's both, we got a COVID-19, which is a scale we have never seen before, but at the same time, SARS did not affect us the same way as a lot of Asian countries, right? So we cannot imagine that type of damage or disruption we are going to face. But I think a lot of Asian countries have seen that before, and so their approaches were somewhat different from what we have done here. The other thing I would add is that I think we tend to focus a lot on vaccine with respect to the COVID story. But at the same time, when you think about different technologies that are involved and where the patent system will be implicated, we have diagnostics, we have vaccine, we have therapeutics, we have health technology. And I think even for those people who are focused on patent, single dose vaccine or double dose vaccine has a very different incentive story than the rest, right? So if you think about, for example, the vaccine for seasonal flu, right, that would be closer to traditional medicine. If you talk about single dose vaccine, right, the vaccines, the incentive story is very different, right? So I think we need to keep that in mind when we think about whether patent is actually a good instrument for actually providing incentives. And the last thing I will end on is about the big issue that I think is confronting a lot of the pharmaceutical companies as well as life sciences companies, right? So if you look at the Open COVID Pledge, you see a lot of companies that are actually willing to pledge the patents are basically the IT industry, the electronics, but not really the life sciences and pharmaceutical companies, in part because they don't know exactly when the pandemic will end and when the next pandemic will come, right? So I think it will be important for us to actually think about what would be a good strategy from the time where this pandemic will end or a year after the pandemic ends to the time that the pandemic will come. Because a lot of the technologies that will be useful for the next technology will keep on being developed and recycled, right? So one of the things that we can learn from a lot of the people who focus on vaccine development, they talk about how a lot of the vaccines for pandemic flu or for other things have been repurposed to address COVID-19, right? So those are something that has been going on before the pandemic, right? And so to some extent, the IP system will have some important role to play, especially after the pandemic. And there's no easy way for us to say when we should actually suspend the system and when we should restart the system.
Thank you. We had a question sent through the chat for the panel about bioethics issues in vaccine development, and one of the examples of this would be the somewhat contentious issue in the U.S. with respect to the use of fetal stem cell tissue, at least in the US, right? The two parties differ quite a bit on this. So our policy tends to switch back and forth over time. And the person sending the question said there was some involvement in some of the vaccines development about the use of stem cell tissue. And we may also see some issues with respect to testing. So for example, I know with the Russian vaccine, there's some sense that it was impossible for it to have been tested to the level that we normally think new vaccines would have been tested before mass vaccination was underway, and raising issues of perhaps informed consent there. So how do you see, what bioethics issues do you see that have come up in the course of the pandemic and developing the vaccine and medications and so forth? And have we adequately, do we have the institutions in place to adequately address those as well? Any of our panelists want to tackle that?
There are many issues. I think one of the issues is the testing issue in the first place. I mean, in that way, many people, and it has been in the news also, like many people don't want to be tested. I mean, that is the first issue. I mean, their free consent, and I mean, to ready for it or not. That is one of the issues which one has to tackle. I mean, the government has to tackle. And apart from that, there are other issues which may be like you are talking about the stem cell, use of stem cells. So there are moral issues regarding that. Every country deal it with its own laws. So particularly in India, as you said that in the case of Russian, I mean, that very vaccine. So it has put thrust upon that unless and until we are totally sure about the safety of that very vaccine through the trials which we can have, we cannot allow any vaccine to enter in the Indian market or Indian region. So that is one thing which come to my mind, that this is one of the issues which has been there. So there is one issue which I must highlight, that regarding the price, but it is very much attuned to the humanitarian concern. Like price is a big issue in a country like India. So when testing were going on, it was priced little high, but it was not that high that some startups were just taking care of that. But people reached to Supreme Court of India that it is being priced so much high that an average Indian person cannot get it. So in that way, I mean, sometimes these issues come to the light, that whether it is compatible to the pocket of an average person or not. And second thing is there may be an issue of the quality of the vaccines also in coming days. Like many claimants are claiming that their vaccine is pretty better than the others. So that may also give rise to some discrimination or something like that in that way, which I'm looking at. And as regards to the refrigerators and all that for cooling systems for the vaccines, there are countries which don't have that kind of facility. So given that very fact, whether the other countries are so much concerned about producing that very vaccines which are compatible to the climate which is being there, that is also a big issue. Like I mean, companies may pay less heed to that, and in that way they will be jeopardized. So I think these are the issues which are coming up in this very scenario.
Any of our other panelists want to offer any comments regarding potential bioethics issues? Seeing none. One more question from me, and then Lauren has queued some more up. There was some mentions of infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure, and I know countries seeing that as relevant. I had a personal experience. One of my daughters got married in Brazil, and so we all got yellow fever vaccinations, which was one of the recommended things for going to Brazil. And it turns out the U.S. has no capacity to produce yellow fever vaccinations at the moment. We had one plant, it was closed by the FDA, and this is pre-pandemic, obviously, and we were reliant on surplus French vaccines. So when the French finished vaccinating everyone in France who wanted yellow fever vaccination, they would send the extra ones to the U.S. There were very limited places you could get it, and it was quite involved and quite expensive. So we seem to have let go some of our infrastructure. To think that we have only one plant capable of producing a vaccine that seems relative is suggested for quite a few countries, and we see the fear that we are unable to respond to these things. Is that just a business investment decision, or has the IP system played a role in our failure to keep up in the production side of this? Are there things that we should be tweaking for our bioeconomy, to legal rules and so forth, to improve our local infrastructure?
So I have a thought on this, and so there is a nascent but somewhat robust literature right now on whether or not the private incentives we have to further manufacturing are really present here in the United States, right? Much of drug manufacturing prowess is still kept as a trade secret. You know, maybe the most canonical example of this is the drug Premarin, which is called Premarin because it comes from pregnant mare urine, and so making the drug from the urine of pregnant mares is something which we've now had for 70, 80 plus years, is still kept as a trade secret, and is otherwise within the hands of very, very few, right? So we have all of these kind of interesting manufacturing problems here in the United States, where because we don't have things like patents, or we have things like patents, but because for whatever reason that is not what private industry has decided is the optimal incentive for this stuff, they're otherwise not widely licensed or distributed. So I mean, to a certain extent, one of the things I think for everyone on this Zoom call to think about are ways to further encourage innovations in manufacturing specifically, right? Not necessarily the underlying therapeutic. I realize we talked about that a little bit yesterday, but in just the manufacturing itself. Those being said, right, I mean, if the supply chain is such that it's really wildly cheaper to produce something outside the United States, even with incentives here, that's just what's going to happen. I hate to put it this way, right? But like, one thing to think about is rather than cloistering manufacturing here in the United States as a response to shortages, is investing a little time and money in diplomacy to make sure that when shortages actually happen, we have allies that we can go to get the supplies that we need, as opposed to worrying about us having burned other political bridges for a number of other reasons in the past. Maybe that sparks some reaction for the crowd. I can't tell whether or not this is something that's going to get a thumbs up or get rotten tomatoes thrown at me. But like, borrowing things from friends is a completely viable strategy depending upon what the specific technology is. Acting in a certain way in a world in which we don't really have real friends to lean on, kind of a problem. Unless you're going to do some radical economic surgery to make sure you're only manufacturing stuff that you actually need. So just a thought.
That ties in nicely with Peter's cooperation, competition, and conflict buckets of policies. I don't know, Peter, if you want to follow up on that at all.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what Jake said. And I think a lot of countries are now trying to work with different partners, whether in the region or within neighbors, so that they may make sure that they will be able to get a supply. And I think we also have been having a lot of the manufacturing commitments from other plants that are outside the country, right? I think there are different strategies we can actually put together. But I think we need to keep in mind that one, the patent will last for only 20 years. A lot of the things that are not produced here are actually off patent. Right, so that is not so much about the IP system as opposed to the market or the regulatory process, right? And second thing I think is important, as we have seen with respect to COVID-19, is that even if we have the stockpile, if we do not keep on monitoring the stockpile, a lot of the vaccines, a lot of therapeutics we have may expire or maybe may have gone bad, and that would not be usable, right? So to the extent that we actually care about having a stockpile, but we don't really have a lot of people actually using them. We also need to pay attention to monitoring to make sure that it's effective when we need to use it.
Thanks. And Dr. Zhang, I wonder if if the profits in pharmaceutical from a venture capitalist perspective are primarily in the IP, do we need incentives for venture capitalists to look at investing in the manufacturing as well? Or is that just the reason that's gone to other countries is that it's not worth doing here?
Yeah, I think the patents system really is to protect the innovators, protect their interest in monetizing the innovation. And in biopharmaceutical, that is especially critical given all the capital that's required to develop the idea and translate that into a product. The risk of failure is very high, a very capital incentive. So patents really is critical, I think, in biomedical innovation. But in terms of manufacturing, I think is just purely from patent perspective, it's very difficult to rely on that as a significant incentive, because technology usually is not in how it's made. That's the easy part. Is why that is important to make, and to show that the thing that's made is effective and safe. When it comes to manufacturing, there is indeed some know-how involved, but even there, the know-how usually is not enough to prevent it from being made in a different way, maybe slightly more costly, or maybe a more roundabout way. But I don't see patents play a significant role in bringing manufacturing back to the US.
Thank you. Lauren, you have some questions in the queue for our panelists?
Yes, so the first one is from one of our guests. I am currently working with a COVID diagnostic company. Their expertise is in the manufacturing processes, and they have utilized licensing as their base to secure the biologic component for their diagnostic platform. What is the panel's view to licensing?
I mean, licensing is good. Licensing, great. If licensing gets the job done, and if it gets it done cheaply, then there's no requirement that everything be developed in-house. And I think actually, frankly, with respect to things like COVID testing, for example, where everyone's trying to, operate on an ad hoc and yet standardized platform to doing validation studies, right? Licensing cheaply from a few players, I think, is probably from a public health perspective much preferable than to everybody developing their own system. So I don't know if it works for you.
So if I add upon that, I mean, licensing is always good, but from which perspective you are looking at it, that is also very meaningful. So if you're looking at it from the business perspective, it is one of the inability on the part of that very holder, patent holder, that how can he utilize one of the methods. So licensing is a very viable method in that direction. But when it comes to the accessibility, or this question may be something, he seeks to know regarding that also, like what kind of licensing must be promoted in the cases of biologics. So whether a non-exclusive licensing or exclusive licensing or open licensing, what kind of licensing would be more fruitful to that? So in that way, I think it is a kind of strategic choice, and everyone has to look upon that very situation. But in cases of biologics and all, it's always good to have a non-exclusive and open licensing, to me, at least. So this would be my concern regarding that.
So I just have a quick comment on licensing. So when we talk about a new therapeutic, a new drug, whether chemical or biologics, usually the developer owns the patent. Sometimes it's exclusive license from another company or from an institution. But it happens quite often that the Pfizer's and Merck's of the world, they actually want to own the IP outright. But in licensing, that's usually the exception. In diagnostics usually that's the exception. Because all the different pieces that are involved in terms of different technologies and components, quite often a diagnostic tool involves licensing from multiple players. So that's a distinction between therapeutics and diagnostics.
I wonder, Jacob, did Illinois attempt to license its COVID testing system to other?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, the university, as far as I know, advertises that we have a ready out of the box system for any university that wants to use it. I think, and, you know, we'll have to go online and see whether this is accurate or not, but I think Greenville College recently licensed Illinois' Shield system. And I think there's some public agencies within the state of Illinois that have licensed it too. One thing that I think is incredibly important to note, right, is University of Illinois' mission behind this is not to make a buck. We lose money conducting this system, developing this system. In fact, almost like I were the member of a multi-level marketing scheme, about every week or so, I get an email from the university saying, please, faculty, donate to the Shield system, right? So we can keep it going so everybody stays safe. So, you know, we're losing a couple $1 million doing this. I think that that's important, right? Because the ultimate end goal of this is just radically different from what a commercial developer does, right? If you're a commercial developer and you want to make a diagnostic, like at the end of the day, right, the thing that you really want to do is make money, right? And the University of Illinois' object is different. Like we want to, I don't know, get everybody tested, end the coronavirus pandemic, and you know, we're willing to lose money up until a point. But I think it is fair to say the university is for the most part kind of indifferent to, quote, maximizing profits. So I mean, I think it's important to kind of take these two things separately, right? I mean, licensing out technology when you are less interested in making a profit off your costs is one thing. Licensing a technology out when like you're in profit maximization mode, because that's what you do when you're a private company, that's another thing to think about. So yeah, you know, we've got an open system. It's out of the box, I think. I mean, it's definitely out of the box. I think, you know, any university that's interested can walk in and kind of get the system up and started. And I think at least one college has, but yeah, I mean, good question. Like you mentioned earlier, Andy, why everybody's not doing this. I don't really understand why not. In fact, when we get done on this panel, I'm going to go off for what I think is my 36th or 37th COVID test. You swipe a card, you spit in a tube, you're out of there in 30 seconds, and there's parking.
Well, having been a faculty member at the University of Illinois, the fact that there's parking is the biggest miracle. And if you can license that technology, that would be an amazing thing. Lauren, you've got some more questions for our panel?
Yes, Mr. Yu is going to ask a question now.
Hi, good morning. I want to thank the panel. Ed Yu from yesterday, no relation to Professor Yu. I go by pronouns sometimes by my friends. But I just want to lay out some comments before framing my question for the panel. And really thank you very much for the presentations. They really give me a lot of food for thought and kind of help consolidate my thoughts as well. So with regard to, we talk often about patents, and I mentioned this yesterday, that patents is the terminal end of a whole line of effort from going from basic science translation to commercialization. And what the vaccine effort has shown us is how they radically changed that process, where we went based on data and turned that right around very quickly into a product. And the nightmare scenario is showcasing that when you get a critical mass of data, and then you're able to then leverage things like telecommunications, AI, machine learning, and you can rapidly translate into potential IP, then that kind of turns a whole system on its head, not only in speed, but also as who's to come first. And so I really appreciated, Professor Scowcroft, your perspective, and I'm wondering, how does that reframe sort of Bayh-Dole when the basic science, the raw data in of itself becomes a commodity, but it's not looked upon that way. And then secondly, it was mentioned before, what happens if we translate into a one and done or two and done type of treatment, where you're no longer producing products to treat a chronic medical condition, which I hate to say it is what is more sustainable and profitable business model. But if you then turn on like CAR T therapy, for example, it's a one and done or a 1 or 2 shot vaccine, then do we also think about the different incentives, right? So it's not so much profits now, but what's different this time around from SARS and MERS is not so much the biology of the virus itself, but geopolitical aspects of the term vaccine diplomacy really have come to the fore in this current outbreak. So if profit is not the primary goal, and maybe geopolitical prominence might be the end goal, then that might be something we want to consider. All that as kind of a framework. What I would like to leave with the panel to comment on is with these kind of thoughts in mind, what would be some of your identified policy or regulatory opportunities and gaps that you identified? What can we do about it, especially in light of the incoming administration to put on their radar? So hopefully I didn't ramble too much, but really just thank you again for the presentation. And hopefully I was able to convey what my concerns are.
So if I may, let me try to answer all of those questions relatively briefly in 3 parts, if that is okay. So, and I'll do it in reverse order, right? So let's start off with some of the policies that the incoming administration could do, especially from like a legal and regulatory innovation policy gap filling perspective. And here is my response. I and a number of co-authors have been collecting all of these in a weekly blog series on Lisa Willett at Stanford. This is the written description blog. I can circulate this in the chat later. I think we're up to 26 or 30 of these or something like that now. So if you want to look at all of the possible levers of policy interventions that a new administration that really cares about could do, then we have all been collecting all of these. So rather than listing them now, I'll just say that they're all there. That's the second one. Going backwards, I think your other question was about like, what do we do about like a lot of these one and done therapies? And to a certain extent, that's definitely true, or is going to be true with respect to coronavirus vaccines. And if we want to draw an analogy, is like probably true for some treatments like CAR T and things of that nature, right? So I'm gonna offer a pretty lame answer, and the lame answer is like, that's the $64,000 question or $64 billion question or whatever it is in a lot of innovation policy. I'll say that some of the treatments like gene therapies and stuff like that, I have written some about like exactly what some of the hangups are. To a certain extent, we've quote unquote solved this. I'm really not a big fan of air quotes, but I can go like this. We have solved this in the United States by just charging inordinately high prices for these gene therapies, which on one hand are cost effective, but as a famous economist once said, you can cost effectiveness your way to the poorhouse, right? If you don't have a way to finance things. So, we like, that's how we've approached it now. It's a completely unsustainable trend. You talk to any CMS public payer out there and they're like, yep, we've got like, 50, 60 kids that are going to need a gene therapy soon. And I've had conversations with the governor about whether we do that or have kindergarten, right? So like, I mean, we need to think about how to appropriately encourage and incentivize and pay for some of these one and done therapies. And this has been a long standing problem in the vaccine field. And Anna Santos Rutschman at St. Louis has written, especially spent her entire career thus far writing about just that. Your first question concerned like, what do we do when data is a commodity? And so my relatively narrow area within like the biopharmaceutical IP field is in like the genetics and the genomics genomic editing space. And I'll say that like genomic data as a commodity has essentially been true for a long time. And this even predates things like the Human Genome Project. I mean, I don't know if anyone on this call is from the University of Indiana, but fly base at University of Indiana got started in the 1950s, right? This is a map of fly genetic locations on the 4 fly chromosomes, the fruit fly, the model organism that we have. And so we've been kind of doing this for a long time. I mean, I think for better or for worse, for now, almost every scientist in the field views genomic information as essentially the like raw ingredient that can be used to develop things. I don't think, with some notable exceptions, we can, I'm happy to like expand on this more maybe another time, but with some notable exceptions, I don't think we've really gotten to the point where we can just go from genetic sequence to product. We're certainly getting a lot closer, especially with respect to genome editing, especially with respect to some small interfering RNA therapy, right? This is a lot of the drugs that Alnylam is making or candidates for. And then obviously now with our mRNA vaccines, right? I mean, to the extent that mRNA vaccines are a modular technique, then like the distance between genomic sequence and therapy is still long. But at the end of the day, right, we still are either paying for the therapy and not for the data itself, or we are otherwise encouraging companies to do things like get patents on the completed and final product. So I think that making data a commodity, I don't necessarily, it's not going to be this immediate risk that we're going to completely obliterate the incentives for the actual end product at the end. So I would just be careful about thinking that the solution to this problem is putting shackles on the data. I think if anything, and I think Peter, you mentioned this earlier, if anything, it's like the sharing of genetic sequences, right? Like that's the thing that has ultimately led to the development of therapies. So I would not decide that the solution of there not being enough incentives to develop these things is to otherwise shackle the data. I just don't think there's any evidence to suggest that's going to be effective.
So let me add something to what Jake said earlier. So what you have asked, I think is a very important question. The difficulty I have is that a lot of our policymakers, especially when they're going in the IP direction, they are not really thinking about those issues, right? They love to focus on the old traditional issues and have easy results based on picking the low-hanging fruits, right? But at the same time, I think a lot of those issues are difficult because one is emerging, and two, we do not have a lot of international rules that has been established with a consensus as to how to go forward, right? So I think a very good way to do that is to stay away from the traditional issues and start exploring those new issues, whether it's at the international level, at the regional level, or just at the bilateral level, right? I think for some of the issues with respect to China, you have to do it both at the international level as well as the bilateral level, right? So we cannot just go for one or the other. And I think from the past few administrations, we have seen that we know what is successful with respect to the international level negotiations. And we also have seen what is not successful, and we actually go to bilateral negotiations. The second thing I will add is that I don't think it's that clear that whoever has amassed the most comprehensive and largest data set will win the world in the future, right? So there's, I think the jury is still out there. There are obviously, with respect to a lot of the support from the government, China will be in a good position to actually collect a lot of data. So they will end up with the largest data set. But you can also make a claim suggesting that, well, maybe more cooperation, more public-private partnership will allow to develop a more accurate data set, right? That would be more effective, right? So I think the jury is still out as to which model actually results in a better data set for us to go into the future, right? I think that is quite important because if you have a very top-down structure, there's a good chance that you may have a lot of inaccurate data included within a data set, right? So you basically have a garbage in, garbage out situation. And so I think that is something we should look at as well. And the last thing I want to add, which seems to be somewhat missing from the panel here, which is also quite relevant to the discussion from yesterday, is that for a lot of US companies, I think we need to do better to educate them about the changing environment, about the issues, especially going into China. And I think a lot of times, I think William talked about how we need to actually understand the law, understand the culture. And if you look at, for example, the government, regardless of which administration, those people who know a lot about China, usually they are the odd person out, right? And so they will get overwhelmed by those people who are actually more the generalists. And so I think that is quite important. But a more important thing, I think, for a lot of companies is that if you face any issues, you have to document the evidence, right? One of the challenge I have seen with respect to the ongoing debate about forced technology transfer is that we don't have a lot of evidence about what's going on other than anecdotal evidence, right? We cannot go to a WTO to say that, well, a lot of companies actually have been forced to transfer the technology because of China's policy, but not because they actually want the Chinese market so much that they want to actually give up other things so that they can and go in there. I think a lot of companies, especially those who have been doing business in China for the last 20 years or so, they are going into the market with their eyes wide open. If they actually can get better results, obviously they want that. If there are any problems, they want to address that. But at the same time, I don't think a lot of them are actually so surprised by the bureaucratic environment with respect to a lot of the policies that have been in place in China. I think there's a debate as to whether the development has accelerated in the past 5 to 10 years. I think that's a fair debate. But at the same time, I don't think they're actually that surprising, right? So I think to the extent we want to get more support from our allies at the international level, we want to rely on the international organizations. We actually need the private sector to start collecting evidence so that we have a better paper trail.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, so I want to thank our panelists. One of the benefits, I guess, of the pandemic was that we're able to put together panels with people in wildly different locations without anybody having to endure long plane flights, and we're all able to participate in conferences. So this has been a really stimulating discussion, and there's another panel coming up in just a minute or so on what's next. So I encourage everyone to stick around for that. But thank you again to our panelists. Join me in giving them some virtual applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris, and the rest of our panelists for that great conversation. And I'm really sorry to all the questions we were not able to get to, but please keep them coming in for the next panel. They're great for discussion. Let's take a quick break and resume at 10:10 with our final panel on what's next. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll be ready to start in a minute. Could we do a mic check real quick? Dr. Parker?
I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Dr. Fair?
All right.
Yes. Hello. Are you able to hear me, Lauren?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Dr. Joseph Fair?
Sorry, Lauren, that was me. I apologize.
Oh, sorry,
I thought you said Dr. Fair. I apologize.
I did. And then Dr. Welch's picture came up, so I thought it was him. Mr. Welch?
Sorry, I've been flipping back and forth between the stop video. I'll start that way if you want to see me. There I am.
Hello.
Hello.
And Dr. Tamori, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to speak first.
Great. I think we're ready to go, Dr. Parker.
Okay, so should I start now?
Yes.
All right, well, everybody, welcome back from our short break for our panel 4 and our final panel of the pandemic summit. I want to, before I do a quick introduction of our panelists, I just want to give a quick situational update. Today, US cases, we have over a cumulative total of 13 million cases. If there's any good news in this, over the last week, there has been a slight decline in the number of cases, whether that's just an anomaly with reporting over the holiday weekend, we'll know that in about a week. We have over, as of today, over 267,000 deaths due to SARS-CoV-2 in the United States, and similarly to the cases, there has been a slight dip in the number of deaths over the last 7 days compared to the last 7 days ago. again, whether that's an anomaly over reporting, we will soon know in the next week. And unfortunately, hospitalizations, we are most likely going to see over 100,000 people hospitalized due to COVID-19 sometime this week. It's at 98,000 in the hospital right now in the United States. And I think we began to see some call to action last week. We'll see more this week of a call to action that hospitals around the United States need to prepare to implement crisis standards of care. So some of that call to action is going out right now. On the good news front, we're on the precipice of having not only one, but maybe two vaccines that will reach FDA emergency use authorization approval in the coming week or two or three, certainly by the end of the year. We'll know more in the very near future, but that's certainly good news. And we have more therapeutics that are coming out as well. So our immediate what's next for this panel. Our immediate next, what's next right now as a nation, as a world, we have to continue confronting and fighting and containing the pandemic that we're in. But importantly, this summit has been about to start discussing what's next so that we can take steps to improve our preparedness response posture. And we must do this in the context of the bioeconomy and our ability to leverage data in this new bioeconomy. So I'm proud to announce our panelists that will, for this panel, we have 3 panelists, and I'll introduce each one of them, and then I'll ask Dr. Tamori to be our first speaker. But first, Dr. Joseph Fair is joining us today. He's a modern-day international disease detective who has traveled the world in search of plagues before they become global disasters. Dr. Fair is a scientist, business entrepreneur, media consultant, and builder and creator of public health programs and outbreak responder on the international stage in more than 30 countries. I'm also proud to say that Dr. Fair is a Scowcroft Institute Senior Fellow. Dr. Tamori, I'm also proud to say, is a Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. He is an immediate past president of the Nigerian Academy of Science with experience in virology and disease prevention and control around the world. This includes service as a virologist for the World Health Organization Africa region and establishing the African Regional Polio Network. He is a recipient of the Nigerian National Order of Merit, and he is currently a member of the Global Virome Project Leadership Board. And much more currently, he's actually in the field doing an investigation for a yellow fever outbreak. And then finally, Jim Welch is our third panelist, and he has served 19 years as the executive director of the Elizabeth R. Griffin Research Foundation that works around the world on biosafety and biosecurity to foster global health security. Thankfully, Jim is still in the fight as the foundation has transitioned from the Elizabeth R. Griffin program at the Center of Global Health and Security at Georgetown University Medical School, where he now serves as an affiliate. He is a member, and he was the originating chair of the steering group of the Global Health Security Agenda, where he served as a non-government spokesperson on the Global Health Security Agenda steering group. He has served many other leadership roles in the area of biosafety, biosecurity, and health security. So we are fortunate to have all 3 panelists serve in our final panel of our pandemic summit. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Tamori to provide opening remarks. Dr. Tamori?
Thank you very much, Gerard. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can.
It's been quite a hectic day for me. We had an outbreak of yellow fever in one part of the country, in the current COVID situation that is going on. Another part of the country, we also had Lassa fever outbreak coming. So we're having the trilogy of the toxic problems that are all over the place. And getting internet out of here is a bit difficult, but I have a 5:30 national TV program to give some information about where we are with the current yellow fever. Having said that, I think one of the things I wanted to say was that what next? Of course, what next for us in Africa has to be slightly different from what next in other parts of the world. But it has to be what next so that it fits into what is next in other part of the world. And I wanted to talk about 3 major issues, which I thought for us in Africa will be what next. And what next for us will be owning the process of preparedness and response. And when you're talking about global preparedness, you cannot talk about global preparedness without focusing on national preparedness, because that's the foundation of global preparedness. That's where the problem starts from. And in actual fact, if the problem is taken care of at that point, we probably have we won't have the COVID situation we have now. If Wuhan had taken care of its problem, if the Malibu town that took the case of Ebola in 2014 in Guinea and Liberia, they are taking care of it, we wouldn't have the problem we had in West Africa. Therefore, countries must own their problem. And what do I mean by that? They must be ready to put their resources, reorder their priorities, and get into the play, into the global play. Because your role is to stop that thing before it becomes a national emergency. If you do that, then of course we're on the way to having anything becoming a public health event of international concern. That's the first point. And how do we do that? It is for each of the countries to realize that the problem is theirs. The problem that when people die due to Ebola or due to whatever yellow fever, like I'm going now, it affects every stage of our life. People die, the economy is affected, and therefore we must begin to, and yet we have the resources, I believe, to at least take care of that problem at that level. And I think that's the best message that we need to know. We have the resources, if we spend our money well, to take care of the problem at the source, so that it doesn't become a major problem for the world. Second point, I think I was hoping that what next, how do we get the public in Africa believe their leaders? Each of the different countries, what you see in all the data that we're giving out about COVID, nobody believes them. Oh, the government has come again, all those, because we never trusted our government before. We never believed them before. So when they came down with those figures, nobody believed those figures. And then when people were expecting, I mean, you remember Africa was supposed to be the killing field for COVID, that dead bodies were going to find. Then when nobody was dying, because of course the government has started lying again. So how do we train our people and ensure that the government itself is credible, and ensure that when they talk, the people believe them? Right now in Nigeria, even though we're saying that COVID cases are going down, people have abandoned the use of masks and washing of hands and all those kind of things because they never believed there was COVID in the first place. I think they need to relate this COVID problem to the personal level, to the individual level, becomes a message that I think we need to pass on to our people. As we say here, the government is not going to die of COVID. It is that individual person. And therefore, you are the more important person than even your government in relation to COVID control. And the last point I wanted to make is that we need in Africa to write our own history. The decision about COVID dead bodies all over Africa was based on the history of the past. The history that was not written by us. We knew what epidemics do in Africa. We knew how many people die of whatever things. So it was assumed that Africa is unprepared. They never have the resources to take care of it. Therefore, if COVID comes and is doing like this in Europe, then of course it's going to be worse in Africa. But of course, I think COVID made a fool of all of us. Instead of the way it's behaving in Africa is totally different from what was happening in Europe. And therefore, we are caught unawares. But caught unawares on the good side, that it did not, because if really at that point, what had happened in Europe was happening in Africa, we won't be talking what we're talking now. We only have 2 million cases, about 400 something deaths, which in terms of global contribution is much less than our population, which is about 17%. But however, I think it is not an opportunity for us. It's not for us to say, oh, COVID was not as bad as it was in the place. Therefore, we should relax. This should be an opportunity for us to think the next. When the next one comes, are we still going to be where we are? When the next one comes, are we going to be prepared? When the next one comes, are we going to respond properly? Testing, laboratory. COVID was not the opportunity to build laboratories and set up networks. This thing should have been there a long time ago. Can we take the opportunity of COVID to learn for the future and say, yes, the next one will not catch us unawares as it is? I thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Tamori. Now, I understand that you need to break contact to continue the field investigation and have an interview. Is that correct?
Yes, at 5:30, there's a national TV is waiting for me to, give a feedback on the outbreak.
Do you have a time for one question before you have to break contact? Well, yeah, from your perspective, at least up until now, why do you believe that the African continent has not been hit as hard as other continents with the SARS-CoV-2 virus?
We have various unproven speculations, which research should be able to explain. I think the first point I would like to make is the fact that there's this belief that there are corona-related viruses which may have been circulating in Africa way before, and therefore there's a cross protection. And one of the things we are doing in the research group is to go to archival sera, samples collected way before COVID came in, and check them against the COVID and see what pattern of antibodies we get. That will answer that question. The second one was the fact that, when you look at the demographics of Africa, we have more young people than older people in Africa. And therefore, the effect may not be as severe as it is. There's the talk of the fact that, where the weather in Africa and all that. To me, I don't think that played too much of a major role. But one other thing I think that could have taken importance in our situation was the fact that we are more open outfield. We don't have too many people working in air-conditioned offices or in closed contract. People are out in the field there, and therefore it's a little more difficult to spread COVID in that kind of situation. Those are some of the speculations, but I think we need to do some scientific research to confirm all of those speculations. Over.
Thank you, and so I'll stop there with a question. I know you have to break contact for the interview, and I appreciate you joining us today. And if you can come back after the interview, we certainly would learn from you in the Q&A that will follow. But we understand if you're not able to rejoin us. So
thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to come back.
Thank you. So our second speaker, I'll go to Dr. Joseph Fair to provide opening remarks.
Hi, Jerry. So Jerry, I have a presentation. Should I just go ahead and share my screen?
Sure, I think so. Is that
okay?
Lauren?
All right.
Yes, you should be able.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do that right now. And let me know if you can see that.
Can see it.
Okay, and I think I just need to go in here. All right, so pandemic threats to health, economic, and national security. I know most of you on the call, some of you very well, some of you less so. But it's been an absolute pleasure to work with all of you over the years, and to be a fellow a senior fellow in pandemic policy at the Scowcroft Institute, as well as with my colleagues on the call from the Smithsonian Institution. I'm happily part of the global health program there as well. COVID-19, I know we've talked about it, and I'm trying not to focus exclusively on COVID-19 itself, but more so what we can take out of COVID-19, and as we've talked about what happens next. So COVID-19 has presented the world and governments with the greatest threats to health, economic, and national security, arguably since World War II. Now, some people may argue there's other events that have happened either before or after, but for me, that is, I guess, the most relative worldly impactful event that happened before COVID-19. We're entering the worst global financial recession and depression since the Great Depression of 1929. And we all know that recession ultimately led to a rise in nationalism. We're seeing that again and again, even when it comes to vaccines, and that ultimately led to World War II. So just to think that it stops at COVID-19 and that COVID-19's effect on the global economy, as well as this simultaneous rise in nationalism, can't all be connected would be folly, I think. COVID-19 has brought public health and infectious disease surveillance into the public spotlight like never before. How we speak, how we collect, analyze, and interpret data, and specifically as well as how we choose to communicate our findings have never been more scrutinized. A good example is aerosol versus airborne, and using words that we're used to using with one another because we all assume that we all know these words from our higher educations in public health without really realizing what we're communicating to the public, and them comparing that to the mass media that's out there, movies like Outbreak, and where they hear those terms and what it means in those movies versus what it means when we say it. So we've never been more scrutinized. And I think, a good analogy to this would be the intelligence world post 9/11. Nobody really paid that much attention to them until post 9/11, when they really focused on how they screwed up and how they did not communicate or coordinate with one another. With all the focus on COVID-19, people will undoubtedly die from treatable conditions. And I think that's something that we'll find, for years to come after this. People that didn't go to the hospital, people that didn't get their dialysis, people that were too scared to go in. We just didn't have the resources available for those individuals, and they probably died of a condition ultimately unrelated to COVID, but somewhat related to COVID. And then thinking about COVID as a national security risk, we've always talked about pandemics as national security risk, but they were more tangential, I would argue. I think this has shown us that our armed forces readiness levels is at one of its lowest in histories, and even members of our Joint Chiefs were quarantined. So if we can't even keep our members of Joint Chiefs of Staff safe from COVID-19, that's telling you that this is also a national security threat that we should take seriously, not just in the now. And I'm sorry, trying to switch to my next. Don't know why it's not letting me move. Let me see this part. Okay. Even with record-breaking vaccine development at success rates, we still have a long time before the average person will get the vaccine. And it really is that average person who typically spreads the disease, the person who is not caring as much about their own health and saying, it's not going to affect me, so I'm going to continue my life as is. I think we're seeing less and less of that. And I think, particularly we're seeing that on the most part because of businesses and state governments requiring the use of masks to enter those facilities. With case and hospitalizations on the rise across the nation, restoration of confidence in science and public health is crucial to mitigation and control efforts. We have a lot of work to do to build back our reputations from what all has happened. And we can point fingers everywhere about why public health officials like Dr. Fauci and others have been demonized and what went wrong with this afterwards. But the important thing right now is that we restore faith from the public in our ability to manage public health crises. So between now and a vaccine, mass testing, tracing, and strategic isolation, and I say strategic isolation because I don't think the US, anywhere in the US, would ever accept another wide-scale lockdown. Even if it is being done in Europe and other places, we all know that the US is unique in its thinking when it comes to things like that, and I don't think it would ever be supported. But I think if you had strategic isolations for places like bars and certain restaurants that we know are just inherent spreaders of the disease, we're going to have to offer them financial support. They're typically not the people that are going to get financial support during natural disasters, but they are crucial parts to our communities, and they are crucial parts to the spread of the vaccine. So we can't have both, and we've got to find a way to keep them alive, but also shut them down while the pandemic is ongoing. How do we go from sample to solution? We talked about that earlier. How do we more readily identify novel pathogens as they enter into humans? A lot of the focus over the last 10 to 15 years has been sampling, animals and animal markets and disease hotspots around the world. And, even this current COVID-19 was identified through that mechanism. But what I would say here is that what we have an opportunity to do now with the widespread distribution of sequencing, we can implement a universal disease of unknown origin sequencing protocol for every national and regional reference laboratory. And I think this could be done and coordinated by WHO and obviously in coordination with everyone that sits on the laboratory panels and diagnostic panels. But we should be regularly doing shotgun and high blast sequencing for disease of unknown origin samples. And that's going to tell us what has already jumped into humans. And that's only going to augment what we might find from that first astute observer or potentially electronic medical records. I think that we're not there yet, but the use of EMR and spread of EMR around the world is going to make it easier for AI to become incorporated. It still hasn't beaten the old system, but I think AI is getting close to where we need it to be for real-time surveillance if we can integrate all of the various electronic medical records and other disease surveillance platform and an international agreement to feed that data into WHO. And then how do we link surveillance to both translational research and rapid response? I'll kind of let you read that through that, but I really think it is through these public-private partnerships. And I'll go to what, this is kind of what we see as the ideal world in my mind as far as the disease ecosystem. we need to be able to link all of these very disparate data points. And each of us study different things. Some of us study the host immune response. Some of us study phylogeny. Some of us study behavior and culture. Some of us study climate. We look at mosaic vaccine design and private industry. Part of this is government, part of this is academia, part of this is private industry. We still haven't found a way to link them all together. And this particular graphic came from a project that Dr. Parker and several others on this call and I came up with to try to link these disparate data points using AI and big computing and working with private industry, and as opposed to being a customer to private industry, actually paying someone from private industry, paying their salary to be a full-time engineer dedicated to kind of linking these disparate data points. And I still think there's opportunity to do that, and now is our opportunity. And so I'll stop with this slide. Never has there been more wealth in the world, nor has there ever been more people living in abject poverty. Anybody on this, I think most people on the call work in the developing world, and we can all attest to that. And poverty and disease are directly linked. It's been in the wake of some of our greatest disasters like the Great Depression, the Civil War, that philanthropy and the private sector create many of our most treasured institutions, the Rockefeller Institution, for example, Carnegie Hall, things like that. So we have a lot of billionaires and in some cases approaching trillionaires that are willing to put their money behind this to make sure that at least in the wake of this, we're going to have some safeguards for the future. Global precedents have been set for public-private partnerships that have worked really well. The DRC, Professor Tamori and I were lucky to attend two openings of two national laboratories there, one donated by the government of Japan in coordination with private industry, donating the equipment, and the government of Congo. The other donated by the Mariu Foundation and USAID in coordination with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those labs are now being used to diagnose COVID-19, even though they were originally set up to diagnose Ebola. South Korea, we've often pointed to it being a great example of how it dealt with COVID-19 when that started. And I think that would be a direct example of the investments they made following their experience with MERS. And I'll just leave the last sentence for there, a framework and/or working group for rapid solution development to pandemic threats can and should be developed in the wake of COVID-19. And this is not a new idea, but let's reanalyze and streamline the roles and responsibilities of the US agencies and start regarding pandemics as direct threats to national security. Because when you take it from a nice to have to a security mindset, then you really change, what your level of baseline funding is and how much attention you have every year. And I think I'm over my time, so I'll stop there. Dr. Parker.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Fair. Jim, you're up.
Let me unmute. Thank you, Jerry, very much. And first of all, let me just share what a privilege it is to have been a part of this wonderful conference and how important it was, particularly this year. And I want to thank the Scowcroft Institute and the Bush School and Texas A&M for moving on and at least making this available in this format. And I hope people have garnered as much from this as I have. It's just been, the discussions have been tremendous. I'm going to throw some slides up here, if I may. And are we up? Can you see me? Did I do that right?
I do not see your slides. I see you.
Okay. All right. Bear with me here. My apologies. Okay. Share screen. And are we there yet?
No.
No? Okay. Well, I use pictures, so it's just kind of, it's devastating if I can't get this to work. All right. So if you bear with me, but folks, just bear with me here 1 second.
We're good.
Are we good? Well, now.
I haven't seen it yet.
Nothing happening yet, huh?
No.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do this without slides, so I'm not killing everybody in doing this. So I'll describe the pictures to you. How's that? So,
All right.
so my first slide is supposed to be, can you all envision the Jaws movie poster? Can you do that? Thank you. I probably my claim to fame is a Jaws speech that I've given all over the world. Billy Joe Royal had more songs than Down in the Boondocks, and I had more talks than the Jaws talk. But this was the one that was requested the most. I have, for the audience that's out there, know that I'm the why guy. I'm the one that people brought along to as the motivator. I took this Appalachian accent and milked it like a cow all over the world. And the people in Texas are probably happy to know that most people thought I was from Texas because Texans sound like Tennesseans. But the theme of the Jaws thing just worked perfectly as a biological risk thing, particularly as we worked in regional groups on preparing for biological emergencies, whether they were natural, as in an epidemic or a pandemic, or an intentional and nefarious release of things. And the thematic thing of Jaws was that we need a bigger boat, right? And so this idea, this investment that the world has been making over the last several years has been to build that bigger boat. And the global health security agenda, one of the reasons we became very attached to that was part of that building a Navy to make the boat even bigger than it was and to pay a little bit better attention to that. Now, the next slide that you're missing here, and I'll send the slide so she can share it with the participants. But the next slide you're missing is the mathematical formula for leaning a motorcycle over. And it has to do with how fast can you go on a motorcycle and through a curve and it not fall down. And this is a lot of what we're trying to do when we're managing a pandemic. We're trying to take a lot of data and figure out how we can keep the world moving. How can we keep our economies going? How can we keep our schools open? How can we do a lot of these things despite the fact there's a pandemic going? So we're searching for that. How do we keep in motion and not crash? And at what point do we have to stop the motorcycle to keep that from happening? Two of the mantras that I preach, one of them is that faith without strategy is a wish. And a lot of what we've done in the past, and I'm kind of unhealed now because I don't have to look for the next government contract or anything like that. So if I step out of bounds, I step out of bounds now. A lot of what we've relied on is faith. And we've talked about having a strategy when in fact what we've had is a wish. And faith without a strategy is a wish. And data without a strategy is just data. And somehow we've got to improve on putting those things together. You know, when I started working with these groups that were doing these preparation, these tabletop exercises for epidemic, pandemic type things, what was normally used was the idea that there would be this flu virus that normal therapeutics didn't touch and the vaccine had no efficacy. Now, whether that flu was a natural flu or whether it was something concocted in a laboratory somewhere, nonetheless, that was kind of the thing. We didn't use a coronavirus as the model in the tabletop. I have the feeling in the future we're going to be using coronaviruses and such when we do those tabletops. I think that's one of the plans. But it built off the National Pandemic Strategy Plan that was built for the flu back in 2005 under the Bush administration. That was essentially the genesis of that. There's been several modifications of it as we've moved along. But interestingly enough, when we have that occur to ourselves, we don't use it. I have no idea why, but it was just like the book was something on a shelf. It's not something that we didn't teach all over the world, but it's something that when it occurred in the United States, we didn't utilize it, at least to the extent that I think people expected it to do. What we have now, and this is particularly, let's look at this in a US focus. What we have now is no longer an academic exercise. It's no longer a tabletop. This is real life stuff. And a lot of times, and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody on the planet Earth, when we talked about these kind of situations, when we talked about epidemics and pandemics, we kind of had this false sense of security in the United States that this wasn't going to affect us that much. These things happen in other parts of the world, and we will always have the elasticity to have the luxury to help those places and those regions and those countries to respond to what's happening to them. We did not anticipate, Jerry, thank you so much for starting with those figures. We didn't anticipate that there would be something like that hitting on our home shores, which cripples us from being able to take care of what we assumed we would be able to take care of. We're having an extremely difficult time taking care of ourselves, and that's one of our lessons learned. Certainly another one is that the 10th Amendment to our United States Constitution has not been our friend. We have such a hodgepodge of pandemic response plans because so much has been left to the states. And a lot of times the states have pushed that down to local governments. And so what we've seen happening is decision-making pushed down to where this level of data expertise and epidemiological expertise and all those things are non-existent, yet we're making those decisions. And that's when those decisions start to become, in the days of Tip O'Neill, all politics are local. When you're dealing with something that is as global an issue as a pandemic, to deal with some of those things on a local level, it's not working out too well. So the second mantra I have in this is that managing for now is preparing for next. Obviously, we're not using the game plan we started with. So we've been managing it one step at a time. Now here's hoping that out there, we are collecting an encyclopedia of lessons learned, positive and negative, so that when this happens again, not if, let's get rid of that wishing stuff. When this happens again, we have some experience to fall back on. We have some lessons learned that will enable us to deal with it differently. And one of the things that we really got to rely on, and truly one of the things I've enjoyed in this dialogue, and I'm just going to kind of wrap this up, is having a coordinated multi-sectoral response. And by multi-sectoral, I don't just mean multiple sectors within a government, because we can't over-rely on a government to respond. That's just not within its power, and to keep everything else going. We've got to rely on non-government organizations. We've got to rely on private industry. We've got to rely on academia. There are a lot of components that we have to put together and have a readiness team of those kind of players at the table when something like this happens. And we have to have that on a continuing basis. Somebody suggested we have like a Manhattan Project approach. I can brag a little bit here. My dad worked in the Manhattan Project. That was a one-shot thing. What we have to have is something that's ongoing. We have to have a continuing dialogue between all these institutions, not just in our country, but around the world, that will help us prepare for when that sort of thing happens. My last point I want to make is that in this, and this is to me one of the tremendous transitions that will come out of this, is that biosafety, biosecurity, and global health security are now inextricably linked. This is not just a textbook thing. This is not just a slide in a PowerPoint presentation. We know how important those things are, that particularly biosafety and biosecurity, in developing everything that needs to be developed and delivered in terms of when we have these global health emergencies. And I'm going to lean particularly on the biosecurity side, because this is, I think, is going to have exponentially elevated importance as we move forward in this. And that biosecurity is much more than what we think of it as now. And so what I'm really looking forward to leaning into the future on this is having that multi-sectoral discussions on the increasing role of biosecurity as we move forward. So Jerry, with that, I'll close it out. And I'm sorry the slides didn't work, but I'll send them to you.
Well, you gave us a very good verbal vision. I think we got the vision with your verbal description of it, but we look forward to seeing the slides as well. And I'd like to follow up on your last point with the biosafety, biosecurity, health security.
Sure.
You know, really kind of from evermore. I think I totally agree with you. These are going to be linked as we go forward, and we need to approach it that way. But I'd like to ask you perhaps maybe to unpack a little bit more your perspective on the biosecurity component of this that you talked about and said there's going to be maybe one of the more important pillars of those three things. And what does that mean? What just unpack that a little bit more.
Well, one of the things is I think we primarily think of biosecurity now in the, you know, when I first started in this, as did you, Jerry, biosecurity had to do with farms, and it had to do with keeping the, you know, the outside from coming inside. And what we're looking at biosecurity now is keeping the inside from going outside in intentional ways. And that's our, so when we now use the word biosecurity globally, that's what we're talking about. But I think it's going to, one of the expansion rings is going to be security of the end product itself. It's not just the biological security that's involved in the developing of products, but it's going to be the security of the end product itself. I think of things like this when I'm looking at millions of doses of vaccine going out. You know, this is one of these things that your mind starts to work in different ways when you get in here. But you're talking about millions of vials of vaccine going out from multiple manufacturers. Have this nightmare imagination with me that just one of those shipments is intentionally contaminated. And there is a tragic loss of life as a result of that intentional contamination. And given the information situation that we're in now that people have alluded to quite frequently, how difficult it would be to continue the vaccination program in general worldwide if one small batch of that is contaminated in a way that could be destructive. So we're not just looking at the security on the inside of developing and making sure nobody steals something or does something that they shouldn't ordinarily do. It also has to do with following that product all the way to where the end user happens to be. And I think that's just one small example of how biosecurity will change.
No, thank you. Yeah, we're just going to have to really broaden our scope of and definitions and what do we think about biosecurity and in our new dynamic that we're going to live in. And I'm not sure if Dr. Tamori has rejoined us. I think he might have, but maybe a question that I'd like to pose to all three of you, and particularly with your background in science and biosafety, biosecurity, health security, and this conference, the summit, we've talked a whole lot, I would call it the last mile or the middle mile, a lot about manufacturing, a lot about development and intellectual property and et cetera, but the scientific enterprise has just been unbelievably, it's just unprecedented how the scientific enterprise has responded to COVID-19. But we need to think about that first mile, you know, that basic knowledge discovery and discovery science as well. And for infectious diseases, you know, part of our bioeconomy as we go forward, we're going to need the laboratories as well. And we're going to need the next generation scientists and the leaders, you know, in that first mile of this preparedness and response and that science and biocontainment laboratory, high containment laboratories are going to be, you know, I think a part of that. And it's going to be, I think, something factored into you know, our bioeconomy and an important infrastructure for our bioeconomy. And then further, I think, you know, leadership and next generation. So would y'all like to talk about your views about, you know, that first mile of the research enterprise and particularly any implications for high containment laboratories and the need for that? going forward?
Jerry, I'm happy to say something on that. I mean, as far as the need for high containment laboratories, I think, I think where we have had folly in the past, and any of us in the DoD world especially are familiar with it, is, maybe thinking that something suited for America would be best suited for somewhere else. And once you get there, you can't pay things like power bills and essentials. And so, I think the best investments that have been demonstrated are those that combine both investments in people and knowledge, and giving them doctorates and giving them publications and actually teaching them how to get their own money. I think that's probably the greatest gift you can ever give someone. And then combining that, with federal aid and assistance, et cetera, either, to our own government or state governments, or internationally through like USAID, with technologies. And I think it's true that, to get to Professor Tamori's earlier point, and, Professor Tamori, while you were off, I gave the example of DRC and how well Professor Muyembe has done at, really starting to own health security in the Democratic Republic of Congo, arguably one of the hardest countries in the world in which to work, but he does an exceptional job at it and continues to manage to attract investment in their health infrastructure. I'll stop there, Jerry.
Dr. Tamori or Jim, do you have any thoughts on?
Gerard?
Yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Joe has said, I think the important thing is to see, ask the people who you want to help, what kind of help they require, and working with them to see what is possible. I'll give you a good example. In Nigeria, we have 4 or 5 BSL-3 laboratories. None of them is functioning maximally, because we have different agencies who are building up. JICA came, so many different groups. But many of these African countries, anything you give them, they want to accept it. But I think in providing assistance, you should be able to identify people in those countries who genuinely, can tell you the truth. Fish out those ones. Otherwise, all the investments you're making in those countries are what we call white elephants. They're lying in waste. In my country, as I mentioned, 5 BSL-3 laboratories. None is functioning. And then next year, another company wants to come and build another one in that place. Every department of government wants a BSL-3 lab, and yet you can't manage one. And recently, we had a bit of a problem in the issue of yellow fever diagnosis, which I'm talking about. All we required in the days when the Rockefeller and others were there, we had just one laboratory in the country that was competent to do all the diagnosis. We built a second one when we had the capability. But right now, in my country, want to put a lab in every state, and yet none of them is functioning. Why won't we just focus on just 2? But international agencies who can help would rather, who would rather say this is the advice they give, will go along with what the governments want, when yet they know in their heart of hearts that what the government wants is not the right thing. But you need to talk to the people who are on the ground, who know the situation, and take their advice. Over.
Thank you. Do you think there's maybe a growing role for bilateral university collaboration and perhaps fostering really the next generation scientific collaboration leadership with, I guess in my case, the United States and Nigerian scientists in over the long run, enhancing infrastructure and leadership?
Sorry, the line wasn't clear.
I'm sorry, but yeah.
Gerard, were you asking me a question, Gerard?
Yes, that was for you, Dr. Tamori.
Can you please repeat the question? Sorry, it's a bit unclear from here.
Yeah, so do you think there's an opportunity for an expanded role of university-based collaboration, scientist to scientist, in helping building the next generation, actually in Nigeria and the United States? Because I think we have, we probably I think it was discussed yesterday that we even have our own issues about next generation and getting the future scientific leaders in the United States as well. So maybe there's an opportunity for university-based collaboration enhanced that's educationally based.
Yeah, that's the direction to go. I mean, that's the way to go, starting with bilateral relationship in which you create oases of excellence in those different places and getting a way to coalesce all those oases into a river of excellence in the different countries. And that's the step to take. A lot of times, government to government doesn't really yield the kind of result you get. Get to talk to the people who know about what they are doing. And then also we scientists in the African region should also get involved in governance, informing and getting involved in the activities of government rather than just sitting down in our test tube and assuming that the world ends around our test tube. Whatever we're doing is a purpose, and the purpose is to be relevant to the needs of your society. And until we begin to appreciate that as scientists, we'll probably remain islands, in the center of decadence that goes around in most of those places. So bilateral relations, you know what you are doing, get those together, and then perhaps so many of them around, and then working together in a network, and we can reach what the decision that we need to reach. Over.
Okay, thank you. All three of you mentioned communication at some way and building the need to reestablish trust in our science and scientific leaders and public health officials, and just trust in the data. So how can we go about reestablishing public trust?
Jerry, if I may, this is Joseph. I would say, one thing I would say is start coming up with, a universal set of metrics that we decide to communicate to the public, right? When we communicate that there are, say, 8 million cases of whatever. Now, when we're talking about that, we know that there are not 8 million active cases of that disease that, totally cumulatively since it started, there are 8 million. But what I've learned from painful experiences, when you're communicating that to the mass public and you say there are 8 million cases of COVID-19, everyone automatically assumes you're talking about 8 million people in a hospital and that the system is overwhelmed. And then when they don't see 8 million people in a hospital, they think you're lying about it. And so I think coming up with things like, this is how many hospitalized people we have today, if we can ever, come to a way of, finding those metrics or approximating those metrics, and kind of coming up with those kind of universal metrics that the public themselves will understand, and making it easier for them to understand and giving it less room, to develop conspiracy theories and make up their own mind about what should be done rather than listening, to us.
I want to chime in here. I love the comparison yesterday, and it got me going down a path, but the idea of the literacy that we have with technology is pretty high. The literacy that we have with public health is extremely low. So one of the things that I think we need to work on when we talk about communicating with the public is exactly what some of these figures mean. We have a tendency, and this is part of in my role, is to translate people who went to school longer after college than I went before college to people who didn't go to college at all. There's no reason why people don't understand what an R0 factor is and how important that is in terms of contagious diseases. That ought to be as essential to our working knowledge as finding Google. Those are the kind of things that we need to know now. And I think this is, again, leaning into the future a little bit. Let's look at some basic epidemiology that we need to incorporate into our educational curricula somewhere, so that when things start being communicated, people have at least some understood base of understanding of what's actually being said. Over.
Do you think we scientists do a good enough job of communicating?
Oh, heavens, no.
I gotta say no on that one too, Jerry.
I think
Here's a leading question.
I think scientists do a great job communicating with each other. The professional generosity that is within the scientific community, and this is especially true on the biosafety and biosecurity side, but the professional generosity that is in that science, that pool of knowledge, and how the people like to share and challenge one another and publish, all that kind of stuff, that's magnificent. But when you talk to the people who actually have the effect of it, they're far more interested in the effect than they are the process. Scientists are more interested in the process than the effect, quite honestly. It's how they got there. And a person doesn't want to know how their TV was made. They just want to watch TV. How do I turn it on, right? So get me to that point of information. One of the things that it's difficult for a scientist to say, I don't know. That's a hard thing. And so when they get caught doing something that's changed a little bit later, instead of saying, I don't know, well, you see this on social media all the time. Well, look, this person said this, and then they learn something differently. I've always said, as we go through this process, and this managing for now is preparing for next, is when a scientist communicates or when a health official communicates, they should always preface what they're saying is based on what we know now. Based on what we know now. Because what we know in science is that what we know now can change. Over.
Agree. Joseph or Dr. Tamori, do you have anything to add? Or?
No, so I think that's it. Other than I would say incorporating that into graduate education might be a good idea, at least for some tracks of public health, of scientific communication. It's there in some parts, but not nearly what it needs to be.
Well, let's hope a lesson observed should be turned into a lesson learned after COVID-19, after the after actions are done, that communication is going to have to be really something that we do a much better job on in the future. And Jim, I just wanted to use an example of a person, and I'll even specifically name a person. It was Rich Besser during the 2009 pandemic, when he was the acting director of the CDC, as that pandemic was unfolded, and they were doing their daily briefings, and he essentially started out every briefing is, this is what we know today. Our knowledge and our science is going to change by tomorrow, and we're going to update you on the data tomorrow. And he wasn't afraid to say, I don't know, we don't have that answer yet, but as our knowledge evolves, we will make sure to get you updated. And it's a good model. I want to also go back actually to I was struck, Jim, by your comment about it was the pandemic national strategy during the G.W. Bush administration. And actually, I often use that as an example that for about 2 or 3 years, it was top of mind. Pandemic influenza preparedness was fairly top of mind of most people. And that strategy was actually followed by an implementation plan that was fairly detailed. In fact, it was about 250 pages with 300 action items that had lead and supporting roles. And there was a national dialogue. Perhaps not everybody was in the dialogue, but there was at least a national dialogue that talked about federal responsibilities, state responsibilities, local responsibilities, NGO responsibilities, even individual and family responsibilities. And it seems like since then we've had a proliferation of strategies and plans, and that just means we don't have a plan. So
that was my thought exactly. That means we don't have one.
And so and there was bipartisan support as well. There was political commitment. There was public commitment. How do we get back to that? Do you think COVID-19 the situation that we face is going to get us back there or not?
I think it would be a horrifically overlooked opportunity to do that again. And I'm one of these people that, because we have temporary interests in things, and And I kind of have this fear that when the vaccine comes, and I'm really looking forward to that, especially being in that 65 plus, I think I'm 1C. But that when we get that, people will go, oh, well, that's past. And the interest level will drop. And when the interest level, the funding level drops, all that, all that goes with it. We need to refocus on that. We need, particularly, and I'll be nationalistic here, we need to refocus that as a national strategy. And if you go back to the 2005 book, Jerry, if you go to the part about schools and universities, I think it's 3 paragraphs in there. It doesn't say much about it all, but look at the impact that closing schools and universities has had on the American community, on the American economy. It deserves more than 3 paragraphs. Obviously, we're going to have to come up with some extensive planning and strategies for our educational network from daycare through college, and that we don't have. And if we do nothing else, let's address that. It seems to me, and I tell people this all the time, if a health department can tell you when there's too much bacteria in a pool to keep you out from going swimming, we've got to come up with some kind of data that essentially says that this is you've got to change your operation when whatever the disease is, if its test positivity rate hits this, or whatever data we're going to use to do that. It's a missed opportunity if we don't. But it's like, we know electricity is dangerous, but only every now and then do we touch a live wire and be reminded of that.
I think that's related, and you said it, and I want to pull in Dr. Tamori and Joseph into this too. Is we need global health security, but each nation has to have this as a priority so that we can prevent it at its source. And so, any thoughts about that? And actually, and let me pull up a little bit more. What I'm thinking here is that we have put a lot of emphasis on global health security, and we were thinking that many of these dangerous viruses may emerge in low middle income countries, but SARS-CoV-2 emerged in a high income country. So how can we help ensure that we're going to have, each nation is going to take preparedness more seriously, including the United States?
Well, I'll start. I think we take it. I think we take it seriously at an academic level. I think we take it seriously at a policy implementation level. I don't think we take it seriously on the receiving end, and that's probably one of the things we need to change. It is. I constantly remind people that we are all downwind from someone else. We are all, in that Jaws speech that I used to do, I had an inflatable shark that I passed around the room. And when it got to the end of the room, I reminded everybody that everybody had touched it, you've handled it, and you have no idea where everybody else has been. And the world is really that way. Particularly, one of the comments yesterday, globalization is not going away. We are interconnected in so many different ways. We're interconnected. If they're cutting down forests in Brazil, the world is affected by that. So diseases, all that works on that same process. And as soon as we realize that and wake up to it, we'll be a whole lot better off, I think.
Jerry, I would very much agree with Jim's comment. And Jim and I actually participate in another group that involves some private entities as well. And we've noticed that even presenting that slide that I presented with the various data points, there's interest from the private industry, and we've never really had that before because the private industry hasn't dramatically been affected by an infectious disease in at least modern history. Whereas now, I'll give my own, one of my own sources of income, NBC News. So you would think TV would be richer than it's ever been because everybody is at home stuck watching television. the fact of the matter is all of the major networks are actually bleeding and hemorrhaging money because no companies have dollars to spend on advertising, which is where they make their money. They don't make it off the shows. They don't make it off of any of that. They make it off of advertising. So we have the attention of the entire world right now. Our terminology, things that you would have had to spend 10 minutes explaining before, contact tracing, epidemiology, things like that, like Jim said, that's now part of the common vernacular. And now is our time to capitalize on that before we move on to the next natural disaster. And this is one that has global attention. It's not just a few countries. It's not just Western countries. It is literally every country that's paying attention to this one.
So given that, actually, how do we bring this back into, because this whole summit has really been a lot of focus on the bioeconomy. So how do we have a moment and an opportunity for upregulating and education of the importance of the bioeconomy now that we understand our vulnerabilities?
I would even call it the economy, Jerry. I wouldn't even say the bioeconomy, because I think that makes me think of like diagnostics and vaccines. But when you look at like airline industry, television, you know, everybody that's going out of business because of this, restaurants, bars, this is truly trickle-down economy in a bad way, right? Where you just can't operate, so nothing ceases. You know, the most, I guess, relevant example I can give to this, and it was the hardest thing to explain for such a long time, for those of us who went through Hurricane Katrina, to try to explain what it was like with Katrina before and after. And it wasn't that, you know, a hurricane hit and like your house got hurt and that was bad, but you still went to work and you still went to school and you still did all those other things. Literally everything stopped all at the same time. And so it took us a very long time to come back from that. And, you know, lessons were learned from that. So I think now globally is our chance to do that with infectious disease, because, you know, it's a pre and post COVID world now.
Lauren, do we have any questions coming in from the audience? And while we're waiting for her response, I want to ask one question that might draw in some things. So for Dr. Fair, Jim, and Tomori, have you had an aha moment just in participating in the summit that maybe ties what you've been thinking about in your preparation, your presentations and your open remarks today that you heard in the other three panels that gave you just that aha moment that need to consider, and that might also be an opportunity for any of the other panelists that may want to have a final word too, that on panel 1, 2, or 3.
Jerry, for me, I'll actually just point out one that, and I'm going to steal it from Ed because Ed already pointed it out. But I think Tara's comment on the need to healthicize security communities and securitize health communities was a very aha moment as well. You know, because I think, you know, even from my own presentation, I think making public health and pivoting it into I still think it falls, you know, when anybody that's ever been in government, you know, when cuts happen, they happen to education and health. And, you know, we unfortunately fall into that health category, and I think we're considered a nice to have. Whereas if we pivot ourselves and use this as an opportunity to pivot ourselves to a security perspective, where we are an essential component to national security and global health security and economic security, I really think that, you know, we can capitalize on that, you know, just like we did kind of post 9/11 and post Amerithreat letters.
Jerry?
Yes.
Yeah, I just, for again, coming back from my own environment, the economy in many African countries is people dependent. It's more of informal economy. People go out to market on a daily basis. We saw the effects during this lockdown. We just took lockdown from America and lockdown from all over the world and locked our people down, forgetting that people, they live their life on what they sell or buy on a daily basis. So when you lock them up, that means they're not existing. And any country, especially in Africa, that does not pay premium on its people is affecting its own economy. And until we begin to appreciate that the people are the more important people, anything we do to protect them from biological pathogens and things is also helping our own economy. And I think that's a message I think many African leaders need to look into, that the people, your people, are the more important things in whatever it is you are doing in your development. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Tamari. Lauren, are there any questions?
Yes, Dr. Taylor Winkleman from Georgetown University. She's professor, is going to go first.
Taylor.
Hey, Dr. Parker, it's good to see you. And I wanted to thank you for giving a shout out to the Next Generation. As you might recall, I'm the coordinator of the Next Generation Global Health Security Network. My question is really for all the panelists. As you all are probably aware, our profession is very female heavy and also a little bit bottom heavy in the women, in the female representation, even as can be seen at this conference. There's a lot more men than women on these panels. But also women have been disproportionately affected in their professional lives by the pandemic. Female academics are publishing far less than their male counterparts. And that's often to do with the fact that once schools and daycares closed, women took on a disproportionate amount of the caring work in the home. So I was wondering what policies you all thought would be necessary to support our female colleagues and to protect our bioeconomy, since women are such an integral part of it. Thank you.
Jerry, I'm happy to maybe start with that. I can only give the examples, Taylor, that I've seen in Africa and Southeast Asia that have worked well. And I would say in all of those areas, women have always been disproportionately affected, primarily because they are the primary caregivers. And so when someone gets sick in the house, they're going to be the one caring for them, and that's going to, not allow them to go to market that day and not allow them to collect wood for the fire and all of these different things. And so I've noticed more and more, at least with regards to things like Ebola and Lassa, early engagement of women's societies, professional societies, religious societies, et cetera, has had a very strong impact in disease mitigation and outbreak response. And that obviously hasn't happened as much as it needs to in the United States. And I think it's because maybe it is because of our exceptionalism. We didn't really think about it for here. We've thought about it for other places when we engage them, but we didn't really think about it in our own backyard. But I think that's a very valid point. And I think, one positive thing I would say is that I think that, well, let me say two things. I think one thing, a negative thing is it's not getting enough attention in the news media. And it's something I myself have tried to pay attention to is, you can't give a stay-at-home order without giving someone either money for, childcare or some kind of plan for them to get food and things like that. So you can't just blanketly throw out a stay-at-home order. So I think there has to be just a lot more direct early focus on women and the role that they play in a household that is very unique. And I think that has to be financial and offering, some kind of creative solution with childcare. And I'm not sure what that is yet, but a lot more sharing of duties all around. So I don't know if that answers your question. Or...
So Taylor, you're obviously one of my heroes out there, but I want to share very quickly that I smiled when you were talking about this. Several years ago, I was in a meeting with a group, and I was telling them that female heavy at that time, that meant like 20%. I think if you went to a biosafety meeting now, it'd probably be half. Your veterinary background, when I started working with non-human primate vets, it was an old boys club. That didn't last very long. what's happening right now, I'm an old man, I'm an old white guy. Things aren't happening fast enough. We've had a lot of excuses and a lot of rationalizations, but things aren't happening fast enough to recognize the talent of groups that has been overlooked for generations. I think it's kind of obvious to me that that's passing quickly. Thank God, that's going away. And we're unleashing the talents of people, no matter who or what they are, or where they're from. And we're no longer treating privilege as if it's a zero-sum game contained in a cup. And what we're learning is that the more we distribute privilege, the more that cup falls apart, the better off everybody is. And it's people like you leading the way in that. And I am very hopeful that in 5 years, you don't see that as an issue at all. And I know that 5 years isn't quickly enough, but 5 years, that's just not going to be. Especially after this.
Jerry?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Tamori.
Yeah, I think coming from my background, I mean, the situation is even much worse than what we see outside. There's a good aspect, but the fact is that even among the educated people in my area, they see the preference to have a boy rather than a girl. And I keep pointing out to them that, look, for example, I have 5 children. The 2 girls who are twins are excelling all over the place there, doing great things, which even sometimes better than the boys are doing. But it takes for us to keep saying such things to people that, for them to realize that we are all born with equal talents and we can do whatever we wish to do. I think back in the African environment, the culture has to change. And not only with the uneducated, but also with the educated themselves, because we have that background about this is the place of women and this is the place of men. But that will change. But like I said, it's not changing that fast as it should. And we're seeing in different places, the best of, when Nigeria talks about some of the top people, we are proud of Okonjo Iweala. I mean, we remember her for what she's doing. But we don't remember that she's a woman. We say she's in Nigeria, And the more of such people we have, the more people will then begin to realize that it is not the gender issue. And therefore, back at home, it has to start from home for people to make up the change and say, each child is as important, as good, and can be anything as want to be as the other child, whether male or female. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Tamori. And I think that was the educators have got to change as well. And so, Taylor, thank you for your leadership and leading the next generation. We have a lot of confidence in the next generation. So thank you for your leadership. Lauren, do we have other questions?
Yes, our next question is from Taylor DeCastro from DAI Global Health Securities team.
You're on.
Hi, so my question is for the group, but related to Dr. Fair's presentation. I'm wondering how we can engage the private sector or incentivize the private sector to encourage information sharing and coordination, especially related to disease surveillance and AI.
Thank you. Yes, at least with regards to what we had arranged, with regard to that particular group and how we incentivized them to both, I guess, share their IP as well as, participate in something that could or could not be a money-making venture, et cetera, is we both allowed them to test their products and gave them real-world situations in which they could test their products. For example, Philips technology and software with their molecular epidemiology software. Now that software was primarily designed for use in hospitals to trace hospital-acquired infections, but there was no reason we couldn't roll that out, to say to an Ebola outbreak. The other thing that I'll mention in a way of engaging the private sector, I think, is what I said about maybe one of the big AI people that we were working with there, and I can just freely disclose that it was IBM. When you work with the IBM Watson team, most people that haven't worked with them don't know how that worked, but you come to them as a client and you tell them your problem and they'll give you a quote to solve your problem. And Jerry was very much a part of this, but we came back to IBM directly and said, that's not the relationship we're looking for with you. We are actually looking to pay the salary of one of your engineers that would be 100% dedicated to the vision and understanding of this project, and that, you know, understands artificial intelligence where we're never going to, and will allow us, you know, to create data platforms and data feeds that can all come together, and, you know, that we can actually start making some, go from sample to sequence and sequence to solution. And so I think maybe different ways of engaging the private industry are possible, just you need to have those conversations. It may not be traditional for them, but I think, Jerry, I don't know if you would agree, but I think I found them to be more than open to having the conversations once we started having them.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think it gets back to, you know, earlier conversations in the other panel. You know, having the right incentives is going to be important for the private sector engagement.
Yeah.
You know, and hopefully our policies going forward in the future will recognize that the right incentives are needed.
Yeah.
And that we begin to address some of these things in our after action lessons observed that we can turn into lessons learned, I hope.
I think also, you know, just to add one last very quick point is, you know, since we have such, I would say, strong private sector attention to what's going on right now, when is it going to be over? When can we get back to business? You know, we can make all of them part of the solution. You know, everything from the airlines to, you know, kind of Coke and its ability to distribute clean water and things like that. I think now is our time to capitalize on all of that.
Lauren, other questions?
Yeah,
Jim, go ahead.
Somebody toss something in here, and I get this from having run a non-government organization, non-profit, non-government organization. The role of the private sector is extremely important and should never, ever be overlooked. One of the things that we deal with, those of us who are not in the for-profit sector, is not having the need to make a profit ourselves. To break even is good. That doesn't work in the for-profit world. And as a nonprofit, you come to realize that if somebody doesn't make a profit, you're out of business. Government is rarely the source of innovation. What governments can do is they can provide the climate for innovation to occur, or provide a climate that it's not profitable to be innovative. So one of the things that we look at in pulling all the parties in, with recognition that for-profit companies have responsibilities to their owners, to their stockholders, to whatever, but the understanding that these things are good for them as well as they are good for us. This is not an us versus them thing. I kind of go back, Jerry, you asked about the aha thing. Part of my aha was learning at a higher level about interdependency that we have as a world, and how fearful we kind of are about that interdependency. How fearful we are that we don't make something, that somebody else does and we don't. The question is, why are we fearful about that? What validation do we have to not accept that's the way things are? And I think that flows over into this kind of discussion where we talk about bringing private industry in as innovative partners, and how whatever things that they may be able to offer. Over.
Well, thanks, Jim. Yeah, and I would just maybe put an explanation that the private sector, profit, nonprofit are essential.
Yeah.
That's a lesson observed from the COVID response, and And so going forward, and it's, you know, as we think about the economy, the bioeconomy, you know, I hope that some of the things that we've talked about over these last 2 days can get into the policy discussion mix to enable the right environment. So, you know, for both, you know, it's a whole of society solutions are needed, you know, including, you know, government at all levels, but the private sector, universities, profit, nonprofit are just essential to the solution, even individuals and families. Lauren, do we have any more questions? I know I think we are approaching end time, but there's a burning question. I don't want to leave a burning question on the table either.
Well, we'll make this the last one then. Does the panel believe that the Bush pandemic policy could be presented to the new administration as at least a framework to build from? Could the policy be elevated and possibly used as a framework with WHO similar to the Paris Climate Agreement?
This would be my answer to that. And then I was not involved in the Bush administration at all. But what I would say is, you know, there are several pandemic plans out there, and we don't need yet another pandemic plan. I think, you know, I think we look at the plans that are already out there. We take the best parts of them and what worked and what didn't work with COVID-19, because this presented novel challenges to us, but also it's also come up with novel solutions. And so that's why I emphasize like mapping out our resources. For example, the vaccine production facility at Texas A&M, you know, that's something that most Americans have no idea exists or why it's there. And so, you know, mapping out those resources, and a book that I love, if no one has ever read it, Physics for Future Presidents. Anyone that knows Dave Franz, he'll give you that book.
Yeah.
But Physics for Future Presidents, you know, does really well at explaining, you know, basic science to anyone that's going to be at those command level decision-making abilities, you know, to pull all the resources, all of government ability. And I think we need to do that for pandemics and our pandemic plans, and, you know, not make a completely new one, but just take what's the best of the various ones that have come out.
Our colleague Dave Franz is actually in attendance. I don't know if Dave wanted to make a comment on that.
Hi, Dave.
Had trouble finding my unmute button, Jerry and Joseph. Really enjoyed this last couple of days, and I think you're addressing a lot of really important questions and had a great group of speakers. So thanks again for all you guys are doing.
Thank you for joining us. Lauren, is that, I think I know we're actually past the end time, I think. Or was 12:30 our end date or end time, or was it later?
Yes.
Then maybe we probably ought to conclude, because everybody still has a busy day. I know I have a busy day, but I want to just extend a thank you for everybody that participated, all the panelists, all the participants, all the great questions, all the great dialogue. I'm glad that we were able to do this virtually. You know, I think virtual conferences and summits and discussions are going to be part of our new dynamic. I'm hopeful that we can get back in person the next time we do this, but I think a virtual component of it, I think, is probably going to be our new dynamic. I just want to say that we were able to cover a lot of material, and I think forge some new discussions that have not been part of the pandemic preparedness, kind of the normal pandemic preparedness discussions, and that is the bioeconomy and biosecurity. And we have some hard things to work on, and you know, it may be the intellectual property, the laws that are necessary, and policies to enable the private sector to be a big partner in this. But we can't just establish an industrial policy for disasters. We have to have an industrial policy that enables not only United States capabilities, but global capabilities, so that we can prevent the next outbreak from becoming a pandemic. Biomedical innovation is going to be absolutely essential. Our scientific enterprise has been phenomenal during this COVID-19 outbreak, and again, it's just unprecedented. That in fact, we may have 2 vaccines that are going to be able to be used, at least under emergency use authorization, in less than a year after this outbreak started. That's just truly unprecedented, with some other vaccine candidates still in the pipeline that may follow in with emergency use approval later into 2021. But I think we have a lot of policy work to do in our industrial-based policies in the next administration. And COVID-19 preparedness continue to respond, but I think preparedness has got to be top of mind for the next administration. And I hope everybody stays engaged that's part of this conversation today to help, push and help think and help provide some of the academic rigor that's necessary for evolving the new policies that we need. There's no doubt there's going to be many COVID-19 after actions. I'm one that believes that we need something similar to the 9/11 Commission back after the terrible terrorist attacks in September 11th, 2001. I think we need a similar type objective commission that's going to take a look at this. That may not be able to be possible for another a year before we can have that, but I think we need to have that kind of ultimate after action for this, and it's something that has to, not just in the last 6 months or last 9 months, we have to look back over the last decade. What kind of set us up for not being, our industrial policies and not being as prepared as we could have been. So anyway, I want to thank everybody. One final thing, and I really want to put another shout out for the next generation. You really are the future of the next generation that are participating in this, and however way that I know we can work with you and the Scowcroft Institute and others to help at least try to serve as a mentor for the next generation, and actually for you to mentor us as we think about evolving policies and how to address some of the issues that face our society going forward. So with that, I'm going to close and thank everybody for participating. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you.